The train smelled like coal smoke and other people's misery. Evelyn Hart had been sitting in the same hard wooden seat for going on 11 hours, and the bench had long since stopped feeling like a bench and started feeling like a personal vendetta against her spine. She shifted again, pressed her shoulder against the window glass, and watched the landscape outside turn from scrubby grassland to something harder and more honest. Red clay earth, pale rock formations rising out of nowhere. Hills that looked like they'd been dropped there by accident and never moved since. She had a carpet bag wedged between her feet and a leather satchel on her lap and a hat that had stopped sitting straight sometime around Kansas. She didn't fix it. There was no one on this train she needed to impress. The man across the aisle from her, a traveling salesman of some kind, judging by the sample case he kept fussing with, had tried to make conversation twice in the past 3 hours. Both times she'd given him answers short enough that he'd eventually looked away and found something else to do. She wasn't trying to be cruel about it. She just didn't have the energy for small talk. Not today. Maybe not for a while. She was 31 years old, which in certain circles back east was already a kind of failure. She had dark hair that she kept pinned up because it was easier that way, and brown eyes, and hands that had gotten rougher in the past 2 years than she'd expected them to. She wasn't beautiful in the way that stopped men in doorways, but she had a face that people remembered, something steady about it, something that didn't flinch easily. She was also traveling alone to marry a man she had never met in person. That fact sat somewhere in her chest like a stone she'd swallowed and couldn't quite digest. She'd read every one of his letters a dozen times each. She knew his handwriting, careful, slightly cramped on the right side, like he was used to writing fast and had taught himself to slow down. She knew he'd built the Mercer Ranch from a single acre of contested land 15 years ago. She knew he'd lost a brother to fever 2 winters back. She knew he was 43, that he had a foreman he trusted more than most people, that he preferred coffee black, that he thought the frontier winters were severe but survivable if you had the sense to prepare. She knew all of that. What she did not know, what the last letter, forwarded twice before it finally caught up with her, was that 3 weeks before her train was scheduled to arrive, there had been an accident. The mine outside Iron Ridge, a shaft collapse. 6 men had gone in, 3 had come out, and Caleb Mercer had been one of the ones they'd dragged from the rubble. He'd survived. That was something. But the letter, written by his foreman in a hand that was less careful and clearly more shaken, had said, "He cannot walk. The doctors say he may never walk again. I write this because he refused to. He says the choice is yours, and he will not blame you for it. Neither will I." That letter had reached her in Baltimore, 8 days before she was supposed to leave. She'd read it 4 times standing in the hallway of a boarding house that smelled like boiled cabbage, with street noise coming up through the window and someone's child crying somewhere on the floor above. Then she'd folded it back into the envelope, finished packing her trunk, and gotten on the train. Not because she was heroic, not because of some deep romantic conviction about love conquering all circumstances. Partly it was practical. She had reasons of her own for needing to be somewhere that wasn't the East Coast, reasons she hadn't fully disclosed in her own letters, reasons that had made every day in Baltimore feel like standing on ice that was cracking beneath her feet. But it was also something else, something she couldn't quite name cleanly. She'd made a promise, and the fact that the circumstances had changed didn't seem like it changed the promise. She was aware that most people would think she was making a mistake. Most people could think what they wanted. The town of Iron Ridge appeared in the late afternoon, and it wasn't what she'd expected, though she wasn't sure exactly what she'd expected. The train slowed, and she pressed closer to the glass, and what she saw was a main street with maybe a dozen buildings on each side. A general store, a farrier, a building with a sign that said Teller's Hotel and Boarding in faded paint, a saloon with its doors propped open, a small assayer's office. Beyond the town, the valley opened up into something that almost took her breath away despite herself. Wide, golden brown in the late light, with mountains on the far side that turned purple in the distance, and a river catching the sun somewhere in the middle ground. It was a hard place. You could see that from the train window. But it was also, in some way she couldn't quite articulate, a real place. Not dressed up, not trying to be something it wasn't. She picked up her satchel and stood. The platform was mostly empty when she stepped off. A few men unloading freight. A woman in a gray dress who glanced at Evelyn and then looked away. The station master consulting something on a clipboard. She was looking around, not sure what she was looking for, when a man came through the small gate at the end of the platform and stopped about 10 feet away from her. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something that didn't give easily. He wore working clothes, dusty from the road, and a hat that had been through enough weather to know what weather was. He was maybe 35, though it was difficult to tell. The sun out here seemed to age people in ways that had nothing to do with years. He didn't smile when he saw her. He just looked at her directly, with eyes that were a dark sort of gray-green, assessing her without any particular attempt to hide the fact that he was doing it. "Miss Hart," he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Yes." "Rowan Cole. I'm foreman at the Mercer Ranch." He paused. "I wrote you the letter." "I know." The handwriting was different. Something moved across his face. Not quite surprise, more like he was recalibrating something. "I can take your bags." "I have them." She looked at him. "Is there a conveyance?" "Wagon's out front. It's about 40 minutes to the ranch." He hesitated, which seemed like it might not be something he did often. "Miss Hart, before we go, I want to make sure that you understand the full situation. Your letter was clear. The letter told you the medical facts." He said it carefully, like he'd been thinking about how to phrase it for a while. "What I didn't write, because I wasn't sure how to, is that Caleb he's not the same man he was before. Not entirely. The accident changed things." He stopped, seemed to think better of whatever he'd been about to add. "I just want you to understand that you've come a long way, and it would be entirely reasonable, given what you know now, to—" "Mr. Cole?" She said it quietly, but she said it with enough weight that he stopped talking. "I've had a week to make a different choice. I chose this one." She picked up her bag. "Where's the wagon?" He looked at her for a long moment. Not unfriendly, just careful, like he was storing something away. "This way," he said. The ride out to the ranch was mostly quiet, which suited her fine. Rowan Cole didn't seem to be a man who filled silence with words, which she appreciated. The wagon road wound out of town and through a stretch of sparse pines before opening up into the valley proper, and she could see the land more clearly now. Grazing land, dry but not barren, a creek running in the low ground. There were cattle in the distance, a small herd, and what looked like a burned fence line running along the western edge of the property. "What happened to the fence?" she asked. He glanced at the fence line, then at her. "There's a man in this valley named Silas Kane. He runs cattle, too. Larger operation than ours. He's been making his intentions known." "His intentions being?" "That he'd like the Mercer Ranch. The land sits on the main water source for this part of the valley. 2 creeks converge on Mercer property. Kane's had his eye on it for years. And the accident made him think the timing was right." Cole said it flatly, without editorial. "He'd be correct that the timing isn't ideal for us." She looked at the burned fence line again, thought about it, then looked at the mountains. "What does the foreman think?" He seemed slightly caught off guard by the question. "Pardon? What do you think? About whether the timing is too far against you?" A pause. He looked at the road ahead. "I think Caleb built this ranch from nothing before, and that counts for something. I also think he's going to need more help than he's got." He seemed to realize what he'd said and glanced at her sideways. "That's not a criticism of what you've chosen to do. I meant practical help, ranch hands, legal standing. Kane has lawyers. Does Caleb have any?" "Not currently." She filed that away. The ranch house appeared around a bend in the road, larger than she'd expected, built from rough-cut timber and stone. 2 stories, with a porch that ran the full length of the front. It needed paint in a few places. The barn was solid, though. The yard had been swept recently, and there were 2 dogs that came out to meet the wagon and then lost interest when they determined she wasn't anyone they knew. There was a man sitting on the porch in a chair with wheels on it, a contraption she recognized from a hospital she'd visited once, years ago. He was watching the wagon come up the road. Even from a distance she could see he was broad-shouldered, with close-cut gray at his temples, and a face that had spent many years in open country. He was watching her the way people watch things they've been anxious about for a long time, trying to read everything at once. Rowan pulled the wagon to a stop, climbed down, came around to offer a hand. She was already climbing down on her own by the time he got there. She walked up to the porch. The man in the chair didn't try to stand, which she respected. He'd have known it would have been worse, somehow, the effort and the failure of it. "Miss Hart," he said. His voice was lower than she'd expected, rougher at the edges. "Caleb Mercer." "Mr. Mercer." She stopped at the base of the porch steps and looked at him directly. "You look better than I expected, given the letter." He blinked. Something that might have been the beginning of a laugh moved across his face and died before it got anywhere. "That's not a high bar." "No," she agreed, "but it's a real one." Another pause. He was studying her with something she couldn't quite name. Not hope, exactly. More like someone standing at a door they'd stopped expecting to open. "You should know," he said, "that I'd understand if you want to go back. I've talked to Rowan about making arrangements. There's a train east on Thursday." "You wrote something like that in the letter too," she said. "I didn't come all this way to take a train back on Thursday." "Why did you come then?" He wasn't being confrontational about it. He genuinely seemed to want to know, and the genuine quality of it made it harder to answer simply. She thought about what to say. The honest answer was complicated. It involved a dead man in Baltimore who'd had powerful friends, and a situation she'd left behind that made the frontier feel like the only direction she could move without looking over her shoulder. But there was a truer part of the answer sitting underneath that, something that had nothing to do with running. "The letters," she said. "You wrote honestly. Most people don't." He looked at her for a long moment. "The same could be said of yours," he said finally. "Then we're starting even." She looked at the house. "Can someone show me where I'll be staying? I've been on a train since before dawn." They were married 5 days later, in the front room of the ranch house, with Rowan Cole and a ranch hand named Denny Fitch as the only witnesses, and a justice of the peace from town who said the necessary words in about 4 minutes and seemed grateful to get back to his horse. It wasn't romantic. Evelyn wasn't under any illusions that it was supposed to be. Caleb wore a clean shirt and sat in his chair and said the words the justice of the peace prompted him to say. And she said hers, and then they were married, and the justice was gone, and Denny Fitch had found something urgent to do in the barn. Rowan Cole stood by the window for a moment after the others left and then said, "Congratulations," in a voice that was careful and meant, she thought, a complicated variety of things. "Thank you, Mr. Cole," she said. "Rowan," Caleb said from his chair. "Nobody calls him Mr. Cole. He doesn't like it." "I don't have a strong feeling about it either way," Rowan said. "He's lying," Caleb said. It was the closest thing to a joke she'd heard from him. She looked between the two of them, the particular ease they had with each other, the kind that came from years of working alongside someone through hard things. There was something else underneath it, too. She'd noticed it in the days leading up to the wedding, something careful in the way Rowan Cole watched Caleb. Not pity. He was too careful for pity. Something more like grief already in progress. She understood that. She was, in her own way, doing the same thing. The first 3 weeks were the steepest learning curve of her life. She'd grown up in a city. She knew that was a liability, and she didn't pretend otherwise. What she knew how to do was read, write, negotiate, manage accounts, skills she'd developed working for a law office in her 20s before other circumstances had narrowed her options considerably. She knew nothing about cattle, very little about horses, almost nothing about the specific rhythms of a working ranch. She started from scratch. Rowan Cole was not, she discovered, a patient teacher by inclination. He was direct, and he expected you to keep up, and he didn't slow down to make sure you felt comfortable. But he was also consistent, which was its own kind of useful. If you paid attention, you could learn from him. She paid attention. She learned which horse was manageable for a novice rider, a brown quarter horse named Sutton, who had the personality of a very tolerant older sibling. She learned where the supply ledgers were kept and found, within the first week, that 2 of the accounts needed immediate attention: a feed supplier who'd been overcharging for 3 months, and an error in the cattle registry that could have caused legal problems down the line. She corrected both. When she showed Rowan the corrected ledger, he looked at it for a long time without saying anything. "You found that in a week," he said finally. "The error's fairly obvious if you're looking." "I wasn't looking," he said. "I was out riding fence." A pause. "I'll be out riding fence a lot. Caleb needs someone who can manage the books. I'd been doing it myself, but I'm not—" He stopped. Started again. "I'm better out on the land." Then let me do the books. He looked at her, that careful gray-green look. You sure you want that? It's not just adding numbers. There's correspondence with the bank in town, with the suppliers, and there's the situation with Kane's lawyers. What exactly is the situation with Kane's lawyers? He sighed, a short, tight sound, and pulled a folder out of a drawer and put it on the table between them. She read through it that night by lamplight, sitting at the kitchen table after everyone else had gone to bed. It was worse than she'd thought. Kane's lawyers had filed a challenge to the deed on a portion of the north pasture, claiming a boundary discrepancy in the original survey from 15 years ago. The challenge wasn't necessarily winnable. The survey discrepancy existed, but it was genuinely ambiguous. But it was expensive to fight, and Kane clearly knew the Mercer operation didn't have a lot of surplus cash. She sat with that folder for 2 hours, making notes in the margins, thinking. Then she went to bed, because there was nothing more to be done tonight. And she was the kind of person who knew when to stop working, and when stopping was just avoiding what needed to happen tomorrow. Caleb, she was learning, was more complicated than his letters. The letters had been thoughtful, careful, self-aware. A man who'd processed things and then written about them clearly. The man in the chair was all of those things and also something else. A man fighting a private battle against what his body had become, with a pride that made him resist help even when he clearly needed it, and a humor that surfaced sometimes at unexpected moments, dry and quick, and then disappeared again just as fast. He was not easy to be around. She didn't expect him to be. One afternoon, about 10 days in, she brought him coffee and set it on the table beside his chair and started to leave, and he said, "You can stay, if you want." She sat down. For a while, neither of them said anything. Outside, the wind was picking up. A front moving through, Rowan had said that morning, probably bringing the first real cold snap of the season. "You're not what I expected," Caleb said finally. "What did you expect?" Someone who'd be kind about it. He said it without any particular bitterness, just factual. Women who answer those advertisements, usually they have a way of being kind about it that's worse than honest. "I'm not very good at that kind of kindness," she said. "I noticed." A pause. "Your letters were direct. Yours were too. I appreciated it. I had good intentions in the letters," he said. "I'm not sure I'd have been as honest in person." He looked out the window. The accident, it's made some things clearer. What you actually have, what you were just pretending to have. He turned back to look at her. "I want you to know I don't intend to make your life harder than it already is. I know this is not the situation you thought you were coming into." "It's not," she agreed. "But neither is it the situation you were planning to be in." She looked at him steadily. "We're both in something we didn't plan. That seems like a fairly even footing." He was quiet for a moment. "Rowan thinks you might actually be good for this ranch," he said. "He hasn't said so outright. He never says anything outright. But I know what it looks like when Rowan thinks something's working." "He's a private person," she said. "Rowan?" Caleb almost smiled. "He's a locked door with a broken key. Has been since I've known him." She didn't ask more than that, but she stored it away, the way she'd been storing things away since she arrived, building a picture of this place and these people, piece by piece, understanding that the picture was going to matter when things got harder, and they were going to get harder. She was clear-eyed about that. The first real trouble came on a Tuesday in late October. She'd ridden Sutton into town to deal with the bank, a meeting about the operating line of credit, which was more complicated than it should have been because the bank manager, a man named Ordell Pruitt, had a way of talking to her that made her suspect he didn't take her seriously as a party to a transaction. She'd dealt with men like Pruitt before. She let him talk, asked the right questions, and by the end of the meeting had secured a 60-day extension on the loan payment terms that she suspected he hadn't intended to offer. She was coming out of the bank when she nearly walked into a man on the wooden sidewalk. He stepped back, and she stepped back, and then she looked up at him and understood, with some instinct she couldn't entirely explain, that this was someone she needed to be careful around. He was maybe 55, heavy-set, with a neat gray beard and clothes that were well-made and slightly too clean for the frontier, the clothes of a man who was wealthy enough to not get dirty if he didn't want to. He had small eyes that were very alert and a mouth that sat in a shape like a smile, but wasn't one. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. She went still for just a fraction of a second. He'd known who she was before she said anything. "Mr. Kane," she said. Because it had to be. Silas Kane. He touched his hat. "I'd heard Caleb's new wife had arrived. I wanted to introduce myself since we're neighbors." A pause, waited. "I wanted to say how sorry I am about Caleb's accident. A terrible thing. The mines out here." He shook his head slowly. "They take from good men." "They do," she said. "I hope he's recovering as well as can be hoped." "He is." "And you're settling in? It's a hard place for someone new to the frontier." "I'm managing," she said. He looked at her with those small, alert eyes, and she had the feeling of being assessed, not the way the bank manager had assessed her, dismissively, but more carefully than that, like he was deciding something. "I've been meaning to speak with Caleb," Kane said, "when he's well enough, about the ranch. I have a proposal I think he'd find reasonable, given his current situation. You can always send a letter. I prefer face-to-face." He smiled, and now the smile reached something, though it wasn't warmth. "You strike me as a practical woman, Mrs. Mercer. I hope you'll encourage your husband to think practically as well." "My husband thinks for himself," she said. "Good day, Mr. Kane." She walked past him, back to where Sutton was tied at the post, and untied the horse and got herself into the saddle without rushing, because rushing would tell him something. She could feel his eyes on her back the entire time. She rode 2 blocks before she let herself process what had just happened, and by the time she was out of town, her hands were steady and her breathing was even, but something cold had settled in her chest. She'd been in difficult situations before. She knew what it looked like when a threat was being communicated through courtesy. She pushed Sutton to a faster pace on the road home and let the wind strip the cold feeling away, at least for now. But when she told Rowan about the encounter, that evening after supper, he stood very still for a long moment. "He stopped you in the street," he said. "He was waiting. He knew I'd be in town." Rowan turned away and stood at the window, looking out at the dark. The lamp was low, and the shadows in the room were long. "He's moving faster than I thought," he said. It wasn't to her exactly, more like he was thinking out loud. "He usually lets things drag on, legal pressure, slow burn. He's changed the approach." "Because the accident changed his calculation," she said. "Yes." Rowan turned back. "Did he threaten you?" "Not in any way I could point to." She paused. "It was careful, the way he talked, like someone who's had a lot of practice saying things that mean one thing and aren't technically another." "That's Kane." He looked at her for a moment. "Are you going to tell Caleb?" "Tonight. He's going to want to do something." "I know. And there's not much he can do right now." "I know that too." She met his gaze. "That's why I'm telling him, and not just deciding for him." Something shifted in Rowan's face. He looked at her in that particular way he had sometimes, where she got the sense that she'd said something he hadn't expected. "Good," he said, quietly. And then he went back to looking out the window. Caleb's reaction was quieter than she'd expected, which was in some ways worse than if he'd gotten angry. He sat with his hands on his knees, looking at the middle distance, while she told him what Kane had said, and for a long time he didn't respond. Then he said, "He waited until I was down." "Yes. He's been waiting for something like it for years." He looked at his hands. "Before the accident, I had standing in this valley. Men came to me when they had problems. The other ranchers, the small farmers up in the North Fork, they trusted me because I'd built something they could see." He stopped. "Now they see a man in a chair who can't get to his own cattle without help. And Kane sees that too." "You still have the land," she said. "Land's only as good as what you can do with it." "Then we figure out what we can do with it." She leaned forward in her chair. "I read the legal papers. The survey challenge is real, but it's not necessarily fatal. It depends on whether Kane's lawyers can find an original boundary marker from the initial survey. Do you know where the survey stakes were placed?" He looked at her. "You read through the legal papers." "I read through everything. Where were the stakes?" Slowly, a kind of focus came back into his face. She could see it happening, like a lamp being turned up gradually. He pulled his chair to the table and reached past her for a map from the shelf and spread it out. "Here," he said, pointing, And here, Rowan would know the second position better than I do. He was there when they drove it. Then tomorrow I want to talk to Rowan about going out to find them. If the stakes are still there, if they're still there, we have a physical record of the original boundary. It doesn't win the legal challenge outright, but it complicates Kane's case enough that a judge would have to take it seriously. She looked at him. It's a start. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the map. Where'd you learn to think like this? He asked. Not challenging, genuinely curious. A law office, she said. I worked there for 4 years. I wasn't a lawyer, but I learned to read what mattered. What happened after the 4 years? A pause. She'd known this question was going to come eventually. She met his eyes. Something I'll tell you about, she said, when the time is right. Not because I'm hiding it, but because it's a long story, and tonight we have enough to think about. He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. All right. She didn't know exactly when she'd tell him, but she meant it. She would. She was not going to build something on a foundation of concealment. Whatever she had to explain about Baltimore, about the man who'd come at her in the dark, about the way she'd defended herself and what had followed, she'd explain it, just not tonight. Tonight there was a map on the table and a problem with a legal solution, and a husband who was slowly sitting up straighter in his chair, and she took what she could get. The survey stakes, it turned out, were exactly where Caleb said they'd be. Rowan found them 2 days later. Iron stakes driven deep into the hard ground, still solid despite the years, with the original surveyor's marking on them. He came back to the ranch at dusk with his horse sweating and his jaw set and the information she'd needed. Still there, he said. Both of them. Can you document them? Measurements from a known landmark? Photographs if we can get a camera from town? He looked at her steadily. You're thinking like someone who knows what's coming. I'm thinking like someone who doesn't want to be caught without a record when it does. A beat of silence. Outside, the wind had picked up again, rattling something loose on the barn roof that was going to need to be fixed before the real cold arrived. I'll ride into town tomorrow for the camera, he said. Denny can come with me to witness the measurements. Good. He stood there in his doorway for a moment, the cold coming in around him, and she had that feeling again, the one she'd started having in the second week, which she was trying not to think too carefully about. It was the feeling of someone who was paying attention to another person in a way that was becoming harder to categorize cleanly. She looked away first. Thank you, she said, for finding them. I know this land, he said. Been riding it for 8 years. There was something in how he said it. Not pride exactly, something quieter than that. Like the land was something he'd made his own without being able to put a name on it, and talking about it directly was too close to talking about something else. I know, she said. He went out, and she heard his boots on the porch boards, and then the sound of him heading toward the bunkhouse where he slept, and she turned back to the table and the paper spread across it and tried to put her attention entirely back on the problem in front of her. She mostly succeeded. The month of November came in fast and cold. The first snow hit in the second week. Not heavy, but enough to coat the ground and make the morning chores harder, and the cattle restless. She was up before dawn most days by now, a habit she'd not had in Baltimore, and had developed here out of necessity, and then kept because the mornings, in the cold and the dark, and the particular silence of the frontier before the world woke up, were the only time she felt like she could think without interruption. She was standing on the porch one such morning, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee, watching the sky go from black to a deep gray blue above the mountains, when she heard the door open behind her. Caleb. It was getting slightly easier for him to manage the door and the slight grade of the porch in his chair, and she'd learned not to offer help unless he asked, because asking was important to him. Cold, he said, by way of acknowledging the morning. Yes. She shifted slightly to give him room at the railing without making a point of it. For a while they stood there, he in his chair, she leaning against the post, and neither of them spoke. The sky was doing something extraordinary, actually, the pre-dawn light coming up behind the mountains and turning the snow on the high peaks a faint rose color that faded to gold and then just light. Some mornings, Caleb said quietly, it almost seems worth it. She didn't ask what he meant. She understood it, not as a statement of contentment exactly, but as something more complicated, the way a place could be both brutal and beautiful, and you had to reckon with both parts of it. I owe you an explanation, she said, because it had been sitting in her for long enough. He looked at her sideways. "About why I left Baltimore," she said. "About what happened there." He was quiet, waiting, not pressing. She looked at the mountains. "There was a man," she said. "His name was Gerald Ashford. He was—" She stopped, then started again more plainly. "He was connected to the law firm where I worked. He had a lot of power in the city. He had a habit of using that power in ways that he was confident no one would be able to do anything about." She felt Caleb go very still beside her. "He came at me in my rooms one night," she said. "He'd gotten the landlady to let him in." She kept her voice steady because this was what she'd decided, that she'd say it plainly and not dress it up. "I had a knife on the dresser. He reached for me and I reached for the knife and—" She paused. "He didn't die immediately. He died 2 days later in a hospital, of the wound." The mountains were fully lit now, the gold light spreading down into the valley. "His family had connections with the police commissioner," she said. "I was told there would not be a formal charge. His conduct was too well known, and several people would have testified to it. But I was also told that his family intended to deal with it themselves, and that I should not count on anyone's ability to protect me from that." She exhaled. "I left within the week." A long silence. "Self-defense," Caleb said. "Yes." "And you're afraid they followed you?" She considered this carefully. "Afraid is maybe the wrong word. I'm realistic about it. It's been months. Ashford's family is prominent, but they have other concerns. I think the frontier put enough distance between me and that situation that it's manageable." She turned to look at him. "But you deserve to know, whatever complications I've brought with me." He looked at her for a long moment. "Evelyn," he said. It was the first time he'd used her first name. "What he did or tried to do, and what you did in response." He shook his head slowly. "There's nothing in that story that puts you at fault." "No," she said, "but the world doesn't always agree with what's true." "No," he said, "it doesn't." He looked at the valley. "Thank you for telling me. I should have told you sooner." "Maybe. But you're telling me now, and that's what matters." She nodded, lifted her coffee and drank. The cold was sharp and clean against her face, and the mountains were solid and permanent in a way that felt this morning like something she could put her weight on. She didn't know what was coming. She knew Kane would escalate. She knew the winter would be hard. She knew there were things between herself and Rowan Cole that were complicated in ways she wasn't letting herself look at directly yet. She knew this ranch was not what she'd expected, and this marriage was not a marriage in the way the word was usually meant, and her life out here was daily and unglamorous and exhausting in ways Baltimore had never been. But she was here. She'd made the choice to be here. And there was something she was finding, something she hadn't expected, in the act of planting herself in hard ground and simply refusing to be moved. She stood on the cold porch with her coffee going lukewarm in her hands, and the frontier spread out in front of her like a question she hadn't finished answering yet. She intended to finish it. The camera Rowan brought back from town was an old field model, heavy and awkward, the kind a surveyor or a newspaper photographer might carry. He set it up himself, spending the better part of a cold morning with Denny Fitch crouched in the frozen grass beside the survey stakes, while Evelyn stood back and watched and wrote down every measurement in the ledger she'd started keeping specifically for the legal matter. It took 3 hours. The ground was hard and the light was poor, and at one point the camera's shutter mechanism stuck, and Rowan had to work it loose with a piece of wire from his pocket, which he did without comment, the way he did most things. Not because it was easy, but because stopping wasn't an option he was considering. When it was done, he stood up and brushed the frozen mud off his knees and looked at the stakes and then at her. "That's what we have," he said. "That's what we have," she agreed. "It's enough to complicate Kane's case. It's not enough to end it." "Nothing's going to end it cleanly." He picked up the camera. "Kane doesn't stop because you hand a judge a piece of paper. He finds another angle. Then we stay ahead of the angles." He looked at her the way he sometimes did, that long, assessing look that she'd stopped being unsettled by and started reading more carefully. There was something in it she hadn't quite named yet. Not doubt. More like someone watching a river they weren't sure was safe to cross, checking the current before they committed to it. "You think like someone who's fought this kind of thing before," he said. "Not exactly this kind, but similar enough." She closed the ledger. "Power doesn't change much across geography. The faces change. The moves stay mostly the same." He thought about that for a moment, then turned and started back toward the horses. She followed, the cold pressing against her cheeks, and she thought about Kane's smile on the sidewalk in town, that shape that wasn't really a smile, and what it meant that he'd been waiting for them to make the first visible move before he made his next one. She suspected they weren't going to have to wait long. She was right, as it turned out. They had about 10 days. The first sign was a ranch hand named Tully, who'd worked the Mercer property on and off for 2 seasons and showed up one morning to say he was moving on. He wouldn't look at her directly when he said it. He looked at the ground and said he'd gotten a better offer, and he was sorry for the short notice, and that was the end of it. Evelyn paid him what he was owed from the cash box and watched him ride out and then went to find Rowan. "He's going to Kane," Rowan said when she told him. "I know. He probably won't say anything useful. He doesn't know anything useful, but Kane's trying to thin us out." He leaned against the fence post, looking at nothing in particular. "If he can get enough of the hands to leave, we can't work the cattle. If we can't work the cattle, the operating accounts go dry. Then he doesn't need lawyers. How many hands do we have left that you trust?" He thought about it. "Denny, probably Luis, Garrett, maybe. He's been here 3 years and he's stubborn as a post, so Kane would have to offer him a lot." He paused. 4 men, including me. The cattle need 6 for winter. Then we need to hire. Word gets around fast in a valley this small. If Kane's pushing men to leave, he's probably also pushing the word that the Mercer Ranch is a bad bet. Getting new hands means convincing someone to ignore that. "What about the small farms up in the North Fork?" she said. "Caleb mentioned them. He said he had standing there." Rowan went quiet for a moment. "He did. Past tense might be right. Or it might not be." She looked at him. "Is there someone specific I should talk to?" "You?" He said it without judgment, just a question about the practicality. "You're needed here. Caleb can't ride out, I can." Another of those pauses where she could almost see him recalibrating. "There's a man named Horace Greer," he said. "He runs a small operation about 6 miles north. He's been farming this valley for longer than anyone. If Greer says something's worth doing, the other families tend to listen." He stopped. "He and Caleb go back a long time. He might talk to you because of that." "Or he might not." "Or he might not," Rowan agreed. "But it's the best place to start." She rode out to Greer's farm on a Thursday, the sky flat and gray overhead, the road north running through scrubland that had been grazed down to almost nothing on the eastern side. She passed 2 properties that were clearly not being worked, gates hanging open, one farmhouse with a broken shutter banging in the wind. She noted them without stopping. Horace Greer was a lean, weathered man of about 65, with a white beard he kept short and eyes that were sharp and quick despite everything the years had put in his face. He came out of his barn when she rode up and stood at the entrance and watched her dismount without saying anything until she'd tied the horse and walked over. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. He'd been in town the day she'd arrived, apparently, because he knew who she was without introduction. "Mr. Greer, thank you for your time." "Haven't given you any yet." But he stepped back from the barn entrance, which was invitation enough. Inside, the barn smelled like hay and old wood and horses, and it was marginally warmer. He pointed at a pair of crates, and they sat on them, and she didn't waste time on preamble because she didn't think he'd appreciate it. "I'll be direct," she said. "Silas Kane is moving against the Mercer Ranch. I suspect you know most of what he's doing. What I want to know is whether the families up here are willing to stand on the other side of that." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not what I expected Caleb to send." "He didn't send me. I decided to come." A small sound that might have been the beginning of a laugh. "How is he?" "Difficult," she said honestly. "In the way that men are difficult when they're fighting against what's happened to their body. But he's thinking clearly, and he's not giving up." "Caleb never did know how to give up," Greer said. It was fond, underneath the flat delivery. "Drove me crazy when we were in dispute over the north fence line, I'll tell you that. Man would not let go." "That quality seems useful right now." "It does." He looked at his hands. "What Kane's doing, he's been at it for a while. Small pressures. Convincing people that the Mercer operation is a risk to associate with. 2 families north of here already sold out to him last spring. They didn't really want to sell, but he made the alternative look worse than it was." "How did he do that?" "Cattle going missing. A well that stopped giving water the same week Kane made an offer. He said it plainly, without drama. Hard to prove any of it. Easy to understand. And the families that are left?
Scared, he said. Mostly scared. They're not bad people, most of them. They're people with children and livestock, and they don't have the surplus to absorb what Kane can throw at them. He paused. What are you asking me for specifically? Because asking me if people are willing to stand up to Kane is one question. Asking me if they have the resources to do it is a different one.
Both, she said. I'm asking both, because I'm not here to recruit people into a fight they can't survive. I'm here to understand what's actually possible. He studied her. You're careful with the words you use. I worked in a law office. That explains it. He was quiet for a moment. What do you have? On your side right now, actually in hand? She told him. The survey stakes, the photographs, the legal documentation they were building, the operating accounts, and where they stood. The hands they had left, and the ones they'd lost. She didn't dress it up. He didn't seem like the kind of man who wanted things dressed up. When she finished, he was quiet for almost a full minute. It's not nothing, he said. It's not enough. Not yet, she said. That's why I'm here. He looked at her for another long moment. Then he stood up and walked to the barn door and looked out at the gray sky and his frost-hardened fields. There's a meeting, he said, monthly, in town. Farmers and small ranchers from the valley. Kane usually has someone there, one of his men or a lawyer, listening. He turned back. What would you want from a meeting like that? Witnesses, she said. People who've seen what Kane's done, who'd be willing to say so in front of a judge. And if possible, people willing to write a letter to the county land office contesting the way Kane's been using the survey process to challenge legitimate deeds. She paused. I'd also want to know what he's promised them to make them afraid, because what he's promised them might not hold. Greer made that almost laugh sound again. You've thought about this. I've had cold mornings and not much sleep. She stood. I'm not asking anyone to do something that puts them at more risk than they're already in. I'm asking whether there are people in this valley who'd be willing to fight the legal version of this fight instead of just waiting to be picked off one at a time. He nodded slowly. I'll talk to some people, he said. Not promising anything, but I'll talk. That's all I'm asking. She rode back to the ranch with the wind in her face and a feeling that was not quite hope, but was close enough to it to be useful. Caleb listened to her report from the North Farms that evening, with his hands wrapped around his coffee and his eyes on the table, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Greer said he'd talk to people, he said. He said he'd talk. He didn't promise more than that. Horace Greer talking to people is more than I've been able to do from this chair. He said it without self-pity, just flat acknowledgement, the way he had of naming hard things directly. He's the one who matters up there. If he's willing to consider it, the others will follow his lead. That's what Rowan said. Caleb looked at her. How is Rowan with all of this? He doesn't tell me everything. He's been managing the Caleb can't handle it category for a while now. He's working hard. She chose the words carefully. He doesn't like not being able to solve it directly. No, Caleb said. He wouldn't. Rowan's always been better at things you can fix with your hands. Fences, cattle, a horse with a bad shoe. This kind of thing, the legal, the political, it eats at him because there's no physical act he can do to make it better. He looked down at his coffee. That's why I needed a wife who could read contracts, not one who could ride fence. She didn't know exactly what to say to that, so she said, I can ride fence now. Badly, but I can do it. Something shifted in his face. A real thing, not performed. Is that right? Sutton has tremendous patience. Sutton has the patience of a man who's accepted his fate, Caleb said, and this time the almost laugh became an actual one, short, rusty, like it hadn't been used in a while. He let a greenhorn ride him when he was 4 years old too, spent 2 years being insulted about it. It was the most at ease she'd seen him since she arrived. She let it breathe, didn't rush past it. I need to ask you something, she said after a moment. Go ahead. The mind collapse. What do you actually know about what caused it? The ease left his face. Not all at once. More like a slow withdrawal, something pulling back from a window. Why? Because Silas Kane's operation has interests adjacent to that mine. Because two of the men who died were known to have disputed his grazing claims the previous year. And because the timing of the accident, 6 weeks before your marriage, when you would have had legal standing to contest his survey challenges as a married property owner, strikes me as worth examining. A long silence. Outside, the wind had picked up again and something was hitting the window glass. Sleet, maybe, or just debris. The lamp on the table made shadows move. "You think it wasn't an accident," Caleb said. "I don't know what I think yet. I think it's a question worth asking." He was very still. She could see him processing it, the weight of it, the way it would change what the accident meant if it were true, the new horror available in that reframing. "The foreman of the mine operation," he said finally. "Man named Burl Sykes. He left Iron Ridge 2 weeks after the collapse. Moved west. Nobody asked him many questions before he went." He stopped. "I told myself it was because he felt guilty about the men who died. Survivor guilt, maybe." "Maybe," Evelyn said. "Or maybe he was paid to leave." Another silence. "If I start pulling at that thread," Caleb said, "and it goes where you're suggesting it might go, that's not a legal fight anymore. That's something else." "I know." She held his gaze. "I'm not suggesting we pull it yet. I'm suggesting we know it's there, so that when Kane pushes the next thing, we understand what we might actually be dealing with." He looked at her for a long time. "You didn't come out here to keep a ranch house," he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was more like he was finally seeing something clearly that had been slightly out of focus. "No," she said honestly. "I came out here to build something that was mine, and since it's also yours, that seemed compatible." He nodded slowly, like he was settling something in himself. "All right," he said. "We keep it in mind." The trouble escalated 2 weeks into December, and it came from a direction she hadn't anticipated. Not legally, not with hired intimidation, but directly and physically in a way that made everything suddenly very real. Luis came in at dawn on a Friday morning, his face tight, and said 3 of their cattle had been found dead along the south fence. Not from cold, not from anything natural. Rowan was saddled before she'd finished pulling her coat on. She rode out with him, leaving Denny at the house with Caleb, and they found the cattle in the thin morning light. 3 steers, each with a single clean wound, arranged in a line along the fence like they'd been placed there on purpose, which they had been. She stood in the cold and looked at them and felt something go hard and quiet inside her. "A message," she said. "Yes." Rowan stood a few feet away, his jaw set, his hands loose at his sides in that way he had when he was controlling something. "He's telling us he can reach inside the fence line whenever he wants. Which means someone who knows our patrol schedule. Or someone who's been watching it long enough to map it." She looked at the cattle, and then at the fence line, and then at the tree line beyond, where the timber started and where you could move unseen if you knew what you were doing. "This changes the equation," she said. "It does. He's not going to wait for the legal process to play out. He's going to make the operation unsustainable before the judge rules on anything." "That's what I think." Rowan's voice was flat, controlled. "Which means we need to not be here alone when he decides to do the next thing." "Greer," she said, "or someone. We need people who are invested in this outcome, and we need them visible. Kane's doing what he's doing because he believes we're isolated. We need to make him wrong about that." She looked at the dead cattle one more time. Something in her chest was cold in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature. "All right," she said. "Then we stop being isolated." Getting people visible turned out to be harder than saying it, and easier than she'd feared, in different ways. The monthly meeting in town fell on the second Thursday of December, and she rode in alone for it. Rowan stayed with the ranch, Caleb was not able to make the trip, and sat in the back of the feed store where they held it and listened for the first hour without saying anything. There were 14 people there. She recognized Horace Greer in the 3rd row. There was a man she hadn't met yet, wide shoulders, red beard, a wife sitting beside him who kept her hands folded in her lap with the tightness of someone trying not to show they were nervous. 2 younger men who looked like brothers. A woman alone in the corner who had the look of someone who ran her own operation, which it turned out she did. A widow named Petra Holst, who had 40 acres of the best-watered land in the North Fork, and whom Kane had reportedly tried to buy out 3 times. Kane's man was there too. A thin, well-dressed individual named Calder, who worked for Kane's law firm in the county seat and who spoke in the careful, measured tones of someone who'd been well compensated to be calm in rooms that weren't calm. He talked about the survey process, about the county land office's interest in clarifying historical boundary discrepancies, about how the process was designed to protect all landowners equally and ensure that deeds reflected actual, accurate boundaries. He said all of this in a register that suggested he was doing everyone a favor. She let him finish. Then she stood up. She didn't introduce herself as Caleb Mercer's wife. She introduced herself by her own name, Evelyn Hart Mercer, and she said she'd worked in a law office for 4 years in Baltimore, and she had some questions about the survey process that she hoped Mr. Calder could address. Calder looked at her with an expression that was perfectly polite and completely closed. She asked her questions. They were specific procedural questions about the timeline of the survey challenges that had been filed in Iron Ridge Valley in the past 3 years. How many? Against which properties? At whose instigation? In what sequence? She asked whether it was standard practice for a single private interest to file challenges against multiple adjacent properties in the same calendar year. She asked whether the county land office maintained public records of who had requested individual surveys. She asked them pleasantly, with the folder of notes open in her hands, and she watched the room while she asked them. Calder answered smoothly, deflecting more than answering, and she let him deflect because the point wasn't to get answers from him. The point was to ask the questions in front of 14 people who were watching her do it. After the meeting, Horace Greer found her on the sidewalk outside. "That was well done," he said. "It was a start. Petra Holst wants to talk to you." He nodded toward the woman who was standing a little further down, watching them. "She's been fighting Kane on her own for 2 years. She's been waiting for someone to do what you just did in there." Evelyn looked at Petra Holst, who looked back at her with direct, measuring eyes, and felt something shift in the shape of things. "Introduce me," she said. By the time she rode home that evening, the sky was dark and full of stars, and the cold was sharp enough to hurt, and she had the names of 6 people who were willing to put their signatures on a letter to the county land office, and Petra Holst's agreement to share 2 years of records she'd kept documenting Kane's pattern of survey challenges across the valley. It was not a victory. It was more like the first real footing in a long climb, and she knew that Kane would see what had happened in that room and respond to it, and that the response would not be pleasant, but footing was footing. She was almost back to the ranch gate when she heard a horse coming up fast behind her. She pulled Sutton sideways off the road on instinct, her heart lurching once before she saw that it was Rowan, riding hard from the direction of the house. He pulled up beside her. His face in the dark was tight with something. "What happened?" she said. "Garrett quit." He said it clipped, controlled. "Found Kane's man in the bunkhouse when he got back from checking the east fence. Man offered him 2 months' wages to walk. Garrett took it and was gone before I knew what was happening." She absorbed that. 3 hands now. 3 hands, and the winter deepening, and Kane watching every move. "All right," she said. "That's all you've got? All right? What else should I have?" She looked at him. In the dark, his face was hard to read, but she could hear it. The frustration, the something underneath the frustration that was more complicated. "I don't know," he said. "Most people would be scared." "I'm scared," she said. "I'm just also thinking." A pause. The horses were close together on the road, their breath making vapor in the cold air. "How did the meeting go, Chat?" he said. "Better than expected." She told him about Petra Holst, about the 6 signatures, about Calder, and the questions she'd asked. He listened without interrupting, the way he always listened, completely, like he was storing every piece of it. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Kane's going to know by morning," he said. "I know." "And he's going to move." "Yes." "Then we need to be ready for it." "Yes." She looked at him, at the shape of him in the dark, the solid, careful, contained thing that he was. "Rowan, are you all right?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. She watched him deal with that, the slight reorientation, like someone who'd been asked to look at something directly that they usually only looked at from the side. "I'm fine," he said. "That's not what I asked." A beat of silence. "I'm worried about Caleb," he said. He had a harder day today. The pain's been worse this week, and he won't say so. He's getting worse at hiding it. She heard what was underneath that. All of it. I know, she said quietly. They rode the rest of the way to the ranch without talking, close enough that their horses' shoulders were nearly touching, and she thought about Caleb in his chair in the firelight, and the way he laughed when he did, and the slow, difficult work of watching someone you cared about endure something you couldn't fix. And she thought about Rowan riding fence in the cold for 8 years on land that wasn't his, and being loyal to it anyway. And she thought about what it meant that she was here, that she had chosen to be here, and that the choice had become something she no longer questioned. When they reached the yard, she took care of Sutton herself, brushing him down in the lantern light of the barn, while Rowan saw to his own horse 3 stalls down. Neither of them said much, but when she was done and picked up the lantern to go inside, he said her name. She turned. He was standing at the entrance to his horse's stall, one hand on the wood, looking at her across the barn in that way, that particular way. And she understood, with a clarity that was not comfortable and not simple, that whatever this was between them, it was not nothing. "Good night," he said. The word was careful, deliberate, like it was standing in for something neither of them was ready to say. "Good night," she said back. She walked to the house, and her footsteps in the frozen yard were loud in the dark, and she kept her eyes forward and her breath even, and she was grateful for the cold on her face because it gave her something to focus on that wasn't the thing she'd just chosen not to think about. Not yet. Kane's response came faster than either of them had expected, and it didn't come through lawyers. It came through fire. The Alderman Farm, a small operation 5 miles north of the Mercer property, run by a couple named Walt and Ruth Alderman, who had been among the 6 signatures on Evelyn's letter to the county land office, burned on a Sunday night in the 2nd week of December. Not the house, the barn. But a barn in winter, with feedstock and 2 horses and the equipment that made spring planting possible, was not a small thing to lose. Walt Alderman came to the Mercer Ranch the next morning with his hat in his hands and his face ash gray and said he was sorry, that he had to withdraw his name from the letter, that he had children and he couldn't risk the house next. Evelyn told him she understood. She meant it. After he left, she stood in the yard in the cold for a long moment and felt the weight of what had happened. Not just the fire, but the message in it. Kane was telling every name on that letter what happened to people who signed things. Rowan found her there. "You heard," she said. "I heard." He came to stand beside her. 2 signatures are going to follow Alderman's. Maybe 3. People with children don't have the same calculus. "I know. It doesn't undo what you built. Greer's still there. Petra Holst isn't going anywhere. I'd be surprised if anything short of the building falling on her changes her mind." He paused. "But Kane's raised the stakes." "He has." She turned to look at him. He burned a barn to pull 3 names off a letter, which means the letter scared him. Rowan was quiet for a moment. "That's one way to read it." "What's another?" "That he burned a barn because he can, and because making people afraid costs him nothing, and because he wants us to know we can't protect everyone." He said it evenly, but she could hear the thing underneath it. The particular frustration of a man who understood violence as a language and hated that it was being spoken around people who couldn't speak it back. "We can't protect everyone," she said. "That's true. We're not trying to protect everyone. We're trying to build enough of a legal case that when federal oversight comes into this valley, Kane's position collapses." "Federal oversight," Rowan said, with a flatness that was almost dry. "I've been writing letters," she said, "to the regional land commissioner, to the federal marshal's office in the county seat, to 2 newspapers." She looked at him steadily. "It takes time. I know it takes time. But it's the thread we pull. While he burns barns." "While he burns barns," she agreed. "Yes." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't entirely read, something between frustration and something more complicated that he folded back before it got anywhere. "All right," he said. "What do you need from me?" "Right now, I need you to ride up to Petra Holst's place and tell her what happened to the Aldermans before she hears it from someone who might frame it the wrong way. And I need you to ask her if she has any documentation of the original survey on her property that predates Kane's challenges." He nodded, already moving. "Rowan." He stopped and turned. "Be careful on the road." He held her gaze for a beat longer than he needed to. Then he said, "I'm always careful," and went to saddle his horse. It wasn't entirely true, she thought, watching him go. Rowan Cole was careful about most things, but there were certain categories of risk he walked toward rather than away from, and she was starting to understand which ones those were. The week that followed was the hardest stretch yet. Luis's horse threw a shoe on the east fence road, and he came back with a twisted ankle, which put him out of rotation for 3 days. The temperature dropped 12 degrees in 2 days, and the creek that fed the South Cattle Basin partially froze, which meant running water to the herd by hand. Slow, brutal work in the cold that 8 hours from every day. The letter from the county land office came back, formally acknowledging receipt of their petition and informing them that the matter would be reviewed in the next regular session, which was 63 days away. 63 days. She put the letter in the folder and did not let herself think too long about what 63 days meant given the pace at which Kane was moving. Caleb's pain was getting worse. He didn't say so, but she could see it in the set of his jaw by late afternoon, and in the way he sometimes went very still without warning, like he was managing something that required all his concentration. She ordered better medication from the doctor in town and paid for it from the household accounts without telling him first, which led to the closest thing to an argument they'd had. "I don't need you managing my medical care," he said when he found the receipt. "You weren't managing it yourself." "That's my choice to make." "It was affecting your ability to think clearly," she said. "Which affects the ranch. I made a practical decision." He stared at her. "You are the most infuriating person I have ever—" He stopped, seemed to realize something. "You're right," he said, differently. "That doesn't mean I have to like it." "You don't have to like it," she said. He looked at her for a moment, and something moved across his face, something that might have been grief or gratitude, or both at once, because they looked alike sometimes. "Evelyn," he said. "Caleb. Thank you." He said it gruffly, without looking at her directly. "For all of it. She didn't make it into more than it was." "You're welcome," she said, and went back to the books. It was Rowan who found the second piece of what she'd been looking for. He'd ridden north to the Holst property twice that week, and on the second visit, Petra Holst had brought out a wooden box of documents she'd been keeping locked in her cellar for 2 years. Original deeds, survey correspondence, and 3 letters between the county surveyor's office and a private land company that Petra had acquired through a contact at the county records office who owed her a favor. The letters were dated from 4 years ago. The land company referenced was called the Consolidated Valley Land and Grazing Company, a name that appeared on none of Kane's public-facing business materials. But the address on the letters corresponded exactly to Kane's ranch headquarters, and 2 of the letters referenced the specific survey coordinates of the Mercer North pasture, well before the challenge had been formally filed. She read through them twice at the kitchen table, very carefully, then set them down. "He was planning this before the accident," she said. Rowan sat across from her, watching her face. "Yes." The survey challenge wasn't opportunistic. He had the Mercer property targeted for years. She tapped the second letter. "And if he was coordinating with the county surveyor's office, then the surveyor himself may be compromised, which means any new survey ordered by the land commissioner's office could come back falsified." She felt cold in a way that wasn't the weather. "We can't let this go through the local process. We need federal jurisdiction. That takes time we may not have." "I know." She pressed her fingers against the table, thinking. "But this—" She touched the letters. "This is different from what we had before. This is evidence of premeditated fraud. This is the kind of thing a federal land commissioner takes seriously." "Or doesn't," Rowan said. He wasn't being pessimistic for its own sake. He was doing what he always did, which was look at both sides of a thing and name them plainly. "Or doesn't," she agreed, "but it changes our position." She looked up at him. "Where did Petra get these?" "The contact at the records office." "How reliable is that person?" "She wouldn't tell me. Said the source needed to stay protected." He paused. "I believe her that they exist. I believe her that she came by them through someone who had legitimate access." "Then we need them certified. If we can get a statement from the records office that these were drawn from official correspondence files, it's not just evidence, it's proof of official corruption." She looked at him. "Can you get back to Petra tomorrow? I need to know if her source would be willing to provide an affidavit." "I can ask." "Ask carefully." Whoever this person is, Kane will be watching them. Rowan nodded. He started to stand and then stopped. He was looking at her with that particular expression, the one she'd been avoiding examining too closely for weeks now. "You've built something real here," he said, "since you arrived. I want you to know I see it." She looked at him. The kitchen was quiet, the lamp between them throwing its small circle of warmth, and outside the wind was doing what the wind did at night this time of year. "I see what you've built too," she said. 8 years of it." He held her gaze. There was a moment, one of those moments she'd been carefully not having for the better part of 2 months, where neither of them was moving and the silence had a quality to it that was different from the usual kind. Then he said, "Good night," and picked up his hat and left. She sat at the table for a while after he was gone, the letters spread in front of her, and made herself look at the documents instead of the door. The thing she'd been avoiding happened on a Thursday afternoon in late December, and it didn't happen the way she might have expected it to. Not in the kitchen over paperwork, not in some obvious dramatic moment. It happened outside, in the cold, on the West Fence Road, because that's where they were when Denny rode up fast with the news that one of Kane's men had been seen on the north edge of the property, watching the cattle, and Rowan had told her to stay back and she hadn't. They'd ridden out together, pushing the horses harder than they should have on frozen ground. And when they reached the north corner, there was nothing there. Whoever had been watching was gone. Nothing left but tracks in the crusted snow leading back toward Kane's territory. And they'd stood there in the late afternoon light for a moment, the horses blowing steam and the adrenaline of it draining slowly out. "I told you to stay back," Rowan said. "I know. I wasn't saying it because I think you can't handle yourself. I was saying it because if both of us ride toward trouble and something happens, there's no one to get back to the ranch." "You're right," she said. "I know you're right." She looked at the tracks in the snow. I couldn't sit there and wait." He looked at her sideways. "No," he said. "You couldn't." They started back. The sun was going down fast the way it did in December, and the sky was turning that particular cold shade of orange and purple that happened sometimes in the west when the clouds were right, and their horses were walking close together on the narrow road. She wasn't sure which of them moved first. She wasn't sure it mattered. One moment they were riding in silence, and the next she was looking at him directly, and he was looking back at her, and he reached out and her gloved hand met his, and then they'd both stopped their horses and he was off his saddle before she entirely understood what was happening, and she got down too, and on the cold road in the fading light with no one anywhere around them, they stood close enough that she could see the steam of his breath. "Evelyn." He said her name like it was something he'd been holding for a long time and had just set down. "I know," she said. "I know," she said again. He kissed her once, very briefly, and then stepped back and she stayed where she was, and both of them stood there in the cold with the orange light dying above the mountains, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. "This is wrong," he said. Not to wound, just naming the thing plainly, the way he named everything. "Yes," she said. "Caleb, I know. He doesn't deserve, he doesn't." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not pretending otherwise." He turned away and put his hands on his saddle and stood there with his head down for a moment, and she watched him doing the thing he did with hard things, holding it, turning it, trying to find the right place to put it. "What do we do?" he said. "I don't know," she said honestly. "I don't have an answer for that right now." He nodded. He didn't ask for one she didn't have. They rode back to the ranch in the dark, keeping distance between their horses that hadn't been there before, and she thought about Caleb in his chair and the particular dignity with which he endured everything he had to endure, and she felt the guilt of it like a stone in her sternum that she couldn't move. She didn't sleep that night. She lay in the dark and listened to the house settle and thought about choices, the ones you made deliberately and the ones that happened to you, and the question of whether the difference between those two things was as clear as you told yourself it was. She had not planned this. That was true, and it mattered, and it also didn't change what had happened on the road. You could not be unaware of a thing you were aware of. You could not unmake a choice by pointing out that it was complicated. She thought about what she owed Caleb and about what was real between them. Something was real, she believed that. A respect and a functional partnership, and something that, in a different set of circumstances, might have grown into more. She thought about what she'd felt on that road and tried to be honest with herself about it. Being honest with herself had not always been easy. She was good at it in tactical situations, in legal situations, in rooms where she needed to assess what was true versus what people wanted her to believe. Harder when it was about her own interior. What she knew, lying in the dark, she had feelings for Rowan Cole that were not simple. She had loyalty to Caleb Mercer that was not simple. And the situation she was in was not one that resolved cleanly in any direction, and the right thing to do was not immediately obvious, which was perhaps the most honest thing about it. She got up before dawn and made coffee and sat at the kitchen table and worked on the letters to the federal land commissioner until the house started to wake up around her. Work was not avoidance. Work was the only thing she had that was entirely hers, and she held on to it. Rowan avoided her for 2 days. Not obviously. He was still doing everything that needed doing, riding fence, managing the cattle, coordinating with Denny and Luis. But he didn't seek her out, and when they were in the same room he kept to one side of it, and she let him have the space because she suspected he needed it, and because she wasn't sure what she'd say if they stood close enough to talk. On the third day he came into the kitchen in the evening after supper, when Caleb had already retired and the house was quiet, and he sat down at the table and looked at his hands. "I've been thinking," he said. "I know. I can't tell you this is simple." He looked up. "I've known Caleb for 8 years. What's happened to him, what the accident did to him, I would do almost anything to undo that." "I know you would. And that makes this—" He stopped, started again. "I'm not the kind of person who does things like this. I need you to know that." "I do know that," she said. "I'm not the kind of person who does things like this either." She looked at him. "Which is part of why I didn't sleep for 2 days." Something in his face shifted, the acknowledgement of shared difficulty. "What are we going to do?" "Nothing," she said. "We're going to do nothing right now, because this ranch and the people in it need us to be thinking about Kane, not about ourselves. And because—" She stopped, made herself say it. "Because Caleb deserves more than being the last thing we think about." Rowan looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said. "He does." "So we put it down," she said, "not because it isn't real, but because this isn't the time." He held her gaze. There was something in it, some acknowledgement that went deeper than words, and then he nodded once and looked away and picked up the coffee mug that was sitting cold in front of him. "Petra Holst's contact agreed to the affidavit," he said. His voice was flat now, back to business. "She wants to do it with a witness present who's not connected to either of our properties." Evelyn felt the shift in the room and matched it, grateful for it. "Greer," she said, "that's who I was thinking. Can you arrange it? This week, if the weather holds." She nodded. She wrote something in the ledger. The lamp burned between them. Outside, the wind moved across the valley, and she thought distantly that there was something appropriate about that. The outside world simply continuing, indifferent to the particular tender disaster of human feeling. The ambush came on a Saturday. She hadn't expected it to be so open, so direct. Kane had always moved through lawyers and shadows and the kinds of pressure that didn't leave fingerprints. But then she remembered what Rowan had said about him raising the stakes, and she understood that something had shifted in his calculation. He was no longer interested in slow processes. She and Rowan were riding back from the Holst property with the affidavit signed and witnessed, Greer's name on it in his careful, old-fashioned hand, the document tucked into the inside pocket of her coat. They were 2 miles from the Mercer Ranch gate when 3 riders came out of the timber at the road's edge and blocked the path ahead. She pulled Sutton up sharply. Rowan's hand went to his rifle before he'd even fully processed what he was seeing. The 3 men were Kane's. She recognized one of them, a heavy-set individual with a red coat who she'd seen twice before loitering near the general store in a way that had always felt like surveillance. He wasn't loitering now. He sat his horse in the middle of the road with a rifle across his lap and his face set in the particular blankness of someone who'd been told what to do and wasn't improvising. "Mrs. Mercer," he said. Not politely. "Step aside," Rowan said. His voice was very quiet, which was the tone she'd learned to recognize as the one he used when he was most serious. "Mr. Kane wants to know what you got from the Holst woman," the man said. "Just the papers. Hand them over and you ride home. Mr. Kane, Evelyn said carefully, can file a request through his attorneys if he believes there are documents relevant to the legal proceeding. That is the appropriate channel. The man with the red coat looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Rowan. Then he looked at the two men flanking him, one on each side. The papers, he said again. What happened next took about 4 seconds, and she processed it in the kind of slowed-down clarity that came, she'd learned in Baltimore, when a situation left the range of options and entered the range of events. Rowan's rifle came up. The man on the left went for his sidearm. She drove her heels into Sutton's sides, and the horse went right off the road into the scrub. Instinct overriding training, and she heard the shot. Not from Rowan, from the man on the right, high and wide. And then Rowan's rifle fired once, and the man on the left's horse bolted with him on it, and the man in the red coat was backing his horse fast toward the timber. And then the road was empty except for her and Rowan and the smell of gunpowder in the cold air. She pulled Sutton back to the road. Her hands were not shaking. She was slightly surprised by that. Rowan rode toward her, his face white under the weathering, scanning her. "Are you hit?" he said. "No." She checked herself, briefly, out of habit. "No, I'm fine." She looked at the timberline where the 3 men had disappeared. "Are you?" "Yes." He was still looking at her in a way that had nothing to do with professional assessment. "Evelyn." "I know," she said. "Let's get home." They rode fast, and she kept her hand pressed against the inside of her coat where the affidavit was. And the document was there, undamaged, tucked against her ribs. Caleb was waiting on the porch when they rode in. He'd heard the shot, sound carried far in cold, still air, and he'd gotten himself to the porch in his chair, which he almost never did in winter because the cold made everything worse. And when she came through the gate, he looked at her face, and then at Rowan's, and then back at her. "Tell me," he said. She told him. All of it. The men on the road, the rifle, the document she'd managed to hold on to. She was careful, precise, left nothing out. She stood in the cold on the porch steps and told him while Rowan stood off to the side looking at the ground, and when she finished, Caleb was very still. "He put armed men on the road," Caleb said. "Yes." "He fired on you." "One shot, wide. I don't think he intended to hit us. I think it was meant to make us drop the document and run." Caleb looked at the valley for a long moment. The light was going fast in the short December afternoon, the shadows coming down from the mountains in a slow wave. "He's done with the slow approach," Caleb said. "Yes. He knows about the affidavit now, or suspects. He knows we have something he doesn't want going to a federal office." "Then the federal letter needs to go tomorrow," Caleb said. "First rider out." "I'll have it ready tonight," she said. He nodded. He looked at Rowan. "You all right?" "I'm fine," Rowan said. Caleb looked at him for a moment with the eyes of a man who had known another person for a long time. Something in his face shifted. Something she couldn't quite read. Something that was both Caleb and something more contained. "Come inside," he said. "Both of you. It's too cold to stand out here." She helped him with the door. He let her, which he usually didn't. And as she followed him inside and Rowan came in behind her and the warm air of the house closed around all 3 of them, she had the feeling of something converging, not resolved, not clear, but moving toward a point, the way a river moved toward a narrows. She sat down at the table and opened the folder and pulled out the letter she'd been drafting to the federal land commissioner and began to write. At the other end of the table, Caleb sat with his hands on his knees and looked at the fire, and whatever he was thinking, he kept to himself. And Rowan stood at the window with his back to the room and looked out at the dark, and the lamplight made his shadow long against the wall, and nobody spoke. And the quiet had the particular weight of a room full of things that hadn't been said yet and might not be for a while still. The letter went out the next morning with Luis riding hard to the county seat, and after that there was nothing to do but wait and keep working and try not to think too carefully about the fact that Kane now knew they were building a federal case against him. Caleb didn't sleep well that night or the night after. She could hear him sometimes in the small hours, the creak of his chair moving across the floor, the sound of him at the window. She didn't go to him. She'd learned by now what he wanted when he was like that, which was to be left alone with whatever he was working through. He would come out of it or he wouldn't, and either way, he'd rather do it without an audience. On the third morning after the ambush, she came downstairs before dawn and found him already at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up, a map spread in front of him, and a cup of coffee gone cold at his elbow. He was studying the map the way he sometimes studied it, not planning a route, but reading the land itself, the way you read something you knew so well that every marking meant something specific. "Sit down," he said, without looking up. She sat. He was quiet for another minute. Then he said, "I know about Rowan." The words landed in the room and stayed there. She didn't say anything. She had learned, in the law office and before and after it, that the worst thing you could do in a serious moment was fill it with words that were only there to manage your own discomfort. Caleb looked up from the map. His face was not what she'd expected. She'd been braced for anger, for cold betrayal, for the particular injury of a man who'd been wronged in a way that he had every right to be furious about. What she saw instead was something older and tireder than anger, and worse in its own way because it meant he'd already been carrying it for a while. "How long have you known?" she asked. "Since before the road," he said. "Maybe 3 weeks before that." He looked back at the map. "I'm not blind, Evelyn, and Rowan is... He's never been good at hiding what he feels. He just usually doesn't feel things that inconvenient." She let out a slow breath. "Caleb, don't." He said it quietly, but firmly. "Don't apologize. I've been thinking about what I want to say about this for 3 weeks, and I don't want to hear an apology before I've said it." She closed her mouth and waited. He was quiet for a long moment, turning his cold coffee mug in his hands. "When I wrote those letters," he said, "before you came, I wasn't writing them the way a man writes letters to a woman he loves. I was writing them the way a practical man writes to a practical woman about a practical arrangement that might benefit both of them." He paused. "I think you understood that. I think you wrote back the same way." "Yes," she said, "I did." "And then you came here and you were more than I'd factored for. Not in the way a man means when he says a woman is more than he expected. I mean in terms of what you could do, what you could see." He stopped again. "I've been grateful for that. I want you to know that's real." "I know it is," she said. "What I feel for you is real too. It's just not the same thing," he said. "No, I know." He looked at her directly. "And what you feel for Rowan is also real, and it is the same thing, and that's the difference." He said it flatly, like a man reading a survey. "Here is where the land lies. This is the actual boundary. I'm not telling you this to make you feel worse about it. I'm telling you because I've made a decision, and you need to understand where it comes from." She waited. "This ranch needs Rowan," he said. "And Rowan needs something more than being a foreman on someone else's land for the rest of his life. He's been here 8 years, and he's put everything he has into this place, and he's never asked for anything back from it." He pressed his hands flat on the map. "I'm not going to pretend this doesn't cost me something. It does. But I need you to know that what I'm going to say, I'm saying with a clear head, not out of self-pity and not out of..." He stopped. "Not out of any kind of nobility I don't actually feel. I feel plenty of things that aren't noble about this." "That's honest," she said. "I'm trying to be." They sat with that for a moment. "What I need right now," he said, "before any of the rest of it, is for both of you to help me finish what we started with Cain. After that," he stopped. "After that, we figure out the other thing. But right now I need you and Rowan working together without whatever it is that's been sitting between you for the past week, because we can't afford to have either of you half present." She looked at him for a long moment. The lamp between them was burning low, almost out of oil, and the early gray light was just beginning at the window. "All right," she said. "All right," he said back. And then, with the exhaustion of a man who had done something very difficult, "Make more coffee. Mine's cold." She found Rowan in the barn an hour later. He was working on a bridle that needed mending, sitting on an upturned crate in the early light, with the leather across his knees and an expression of someone who had also not slept particularly well. He looked up when she came in and then back at the leather. "Caleb talked to me this morning," she said. Rowan went still. "He knows," she said. "He's known for a while." A long pause. He set the bridle down carefully on the crate beside him and stood up. "What did he say?" His voice was very controlled. She told him. All of it.
as close to verbatim as she could manage, because he deserved to have it exactly. She watched his face while she talked, watched the things move through it that he usually kept from moving through it, the guilt and the grief and the other thing underneath that she recognized because she'd been carrying her own version of it. When she finished, he turned away and put both hands on the stall wall and stood there with his head down. 8 years, he said, more to himself than to her. I know. I never intended. I know that too. He turned back. His face was raw in a way she hadn't seen it before, the careful control stripped off it. He shouldn't be the one to... He stopped. He should be angry. He has every right to be angry. He is angry, she said. He said so. He's just choosing what to do with it. Rowan looked at her. He's a better man than I am, he said. He meant it. It wasn't self-flagellation. It was just a thing he was seeing clearly. He's a different kind of man, she said carefully. What he did this morning it was one of the harder things I've ever seen someone do. But the point he made was practical. He needs us both. The Kane situation isn't resolved. We're 3 hands short, and there's a federal letter in transit, and we don't know what Kane's going to do next. She looked at him steadily. Can you set the rest of it aside until this is over? He held her gaze. Can you? I don't know, she said honestly, but I'm going to. He nodded, slowly, like someone resettling their weight after a long time standing crooked. All right, he said. He picked the bridle back up. I need to ride out to the east pasture after breakfast. The cattle have been drifting, and if the creek is frozen further up, they'll push through the fence. I'll have the books ready to go over this afternoon. The county's 63 days turned into 41. We should know soon. Good. He looked at the bridle and nodded at her. Thank you for telling me directly. She left him to it. On the way back to the house, the cold was sharp and real against her face, and she was grateful for it in the way she'd been grateful for difficult things before. Not because they were good, but because they kept her from drifting into anything easier that wasn't true. The plan came together over the next 2 weeks, not all at once, but piece by piece, the way most real things did. It started with a conversation between Caleb and Evelyn over the county land records she'd been piecing together with Petra Holst's documents, and it clarified when Horace Greer rode down from the North Fork with news that the Federal Land Commissioner's office had written back, not just acknowledged receipt, but written back with specific questions about the evidence they'd submitted, which meant someone up there was actually reading it. They want documentation of the survey stakes, she told Rowan and Caleb that evening, the letter spread on the table between them. The photographs, the measurements, the dates, and they want the affidavit from Petra's contacts submitted formally through an attorney. We don't have an attorney, Caleb said. Greer knows one, in the county seat, a woman named Foss who's had trouble with Kane before and won't be bought. She looked up. It costs money. How much? Rowan asked. She told him. He didn't flinch, which she'd expected. He had no illusions about the ranch's financial position. The spring cattle sale would cover it, Caleb said. If we get to the spring cattle sale. We'll get there, Rowan said. There was something in how he said it. Not a boast, just a statement of intention. The other piece came from a direction nobody had planned for. Luis, who had been quiet and somewhat peripheral throughout all of this, came to her on a Wednesday morning and said he had a cousin who worked in Kane's household. A cook. The cousin had told him something. What's something? She said. Luis was quiet for a moment, looking at his hat. A man came to see Kane last week, from out of the valley. They met in Kane's office for 2 hours. My cousin didn't hear what they said, but she saw the man when he left. He paused. He was carrying a survey map, the kind with the federal seals on them. Official. She went very still. A federal surveyor? My cousin doesn't know what he was, but the map had official markings. And after he left, she said he was in a bad mood for 2 days, like something hadn't gone the way he wanted. She thought about that for a long time. Kane tried to buy someone in the federal office, she said that evening when she told Rowan and Caleb. And either it didn't work or they asked for too much. Which means the federal process is actually running clean, Rowan said. Or clean enough. Clean enough is all we need. Caleb was sitting up straighter than usual. Something had changed in him over the past week. Some resolution, some decision made in private that had settled him.
If the commissioner's office is running a legitimate investigation, Kane's lawyers can't stop it. They can slow it, they can challenge it, but they can't make it disappear. He'll escalate, Rowan said, before the investigation concludes. He's going to do something to make the property untenable before a federal ruling can protect it. I know, Caleb said. That's why we're not waiting for the ruling. They both looked at him. Rowan, Caleb said, I need you to do something that I can't ask you to do and that you should tell me no to. Rowan looked at him for a long moment. Tell me anyway. Kane's headquarters. He keeps records, actual physical records, not just what goes through his lawyers. He doesn't trust lawyers with everything. He keeps the originals himself, in his office. Caleb pressed his hand flat on the table. The letters about the mine. If the collapse was engineered, there will be something in there. Instructions, payments, a record of Burl Sykes getting paid to leave. He looked at Rowan directly. If we can get that evidence into the federal investigation, it's not just a land fraud case anymore. It's criminal negligence. It's manslaughter. Kane doesn't survive that. Boss! You're asking me to go into his headquarters and take his records, Rowan said. I'm telling you it's an option, and then I'm going to stop talking about it. Caleb held his gaze. Because it's your decision, not mine. The room was quiet for a long moment. It's dangerous, Evelyn said. She said it directly, not as an argument against it, but because it needed to be said. Yes, Rowan said. If Kane has men on the property, he'll have men on this property. Rowan was looking at the table, thinking. But his main compound is about 8 miles east. He doesn't post guards inside the headquarters building itself, just around the perimeter. I've ridden past it enough times to know the layout. He paused. There's a window on the north side that's lower than the others. I noticed it 3 years ago because the wood frame was starting to rot. She looked at him. You've been thinking about this for 3 years?
I've been thinking about Kane for 3 years, he said. The window was just something I noticed. Caleb almost smiled. When? He said. End of the week. He has a meeting in town on Friday. His lawyer, the county judge. It's in the public calendar at the courthouse. He'll be gone most of the day and he'll take his senior men with him. It's the longest window we're going to get. I'm coming with you, Evelyn said. Both men looked at her. You're not, Rowan said.
2 sets of eyes. Someone to watch the perimeter while someone else is inside. The alternative is you going alone with no warning if something changes. The alternative is you staying here where it's, don't tell me it's safer here, she said. Kane has put armed men on this road twice now. Nowhere in this valley is particularly safe. Rowan and Caleb looked at each other. It was the look of 2 men who had reached the end of an argument they hadn't technically had yet. She's right, Caleb said. And she'll go whether you agree or not, so you might as well plan for it. That's not actually... she started. It's true and you know it, Caleb said. There was no heat in it, just the flatness of someone who'd learned to read her accurately. Rowan rubbed his jaw. All right, he said, but you stay outside. You watch the road and the east approach, and you signal if anything moves. Agreed. And you don't come in under any circumstances. Unless you're in trouble. Evelyn, I'll stay outside unless you're in trouble, she said. That's the best offer you're going to get. He looked at the ceiling briefly, in the manner of a man who had no remaining moves. Fine, he said. I'll set. Friday came with gray skies and a cold that was serious but not impossible, and they left the ranch before dawn with Luis holding things at the property and Denny under strict instructions to keep Caleb inside and not to open the gate for anyone. They rode east in the dark, keeping off the main road and taking the longer route through the dry creek bed that ran along the valley's eastern flank. Rowan knew the terrain the way he knew everything out here, not from maps but from years of moving through it in all kinds of weather, at all kinds of hours. He set the pace and she followed, and neither of them talked much. At a stand of cottonwoods about a quarter mile from Kane's compound, they left the horses tied and went the rest of the way on foot, moving slowly through the scrub, stopping twice when a dog barked somewhere inside the compound before settling again. Kane's headquarters was bigger than she'd expected. A main house of stone and timber, a bunkhouse behind it, a separate building that appeared to be the office, and a stable that was mostly empty, which confirmed he'd taken his horses and his men to town. 2 figures moved along the perimeter fence. Slow, unhurried, not particularly watchful. Men doing a job they didn't think needed real attention. Rowan looked at her. She looked at the pattern of movement. She held up 2 fingers and pointed. 2 guards, east and south rotation, which left the north side of the office building unobserved for stretches of about 4 minutes. He nodded. 4 minutes, she breathed. I know. Rowan, she said it quietly. He looked at her. Be fast. Something moved in his face. Quick, there and gone. Always, he said. Then he was moving, low and quick across the open ground between the cottonwoods and the north wall of the office building, and she pressed herself into the scrub and watched the guards and counted. He reached the wall. The window was where he'd said it was. She heard nothing, no alarm, no dog. She watched the southern guard turn at the corner and start his return path, and she pressed further into the brush and felt her heartbeat everywhere at once. Waiting was its own kind of work. She'd always been better at action than at standing still while someone else did something she couldn't control. She watched the guards and watched the window and watched the road that came in from the west, and she thought about Caleb at the kitchen table with his hands on the map, and what it had cost him to send them both out here, and the particular way courage sometimes looked from the outside like something quieter and less dramatic than you expected. 8 minutes passed. Then 12. The South Guard paused at the northeast corner longer than usual, stopped, looked around, seemed to be listening for something. She went completely still. He stood there for what felt like much longer than it was, then moved on. 15 minutes. The window shifted. Rowan came back through it, dropped to the ground with something under his arm, and was moving back across the open ground before she'd fully processed that he was out. He reached the cottonwoods, and they both crouched there for a moment, not speaking, while her heart did what it had been doing for the past quarter hour. He was breathing hard. Under his coat, tucked against his body, was a leather document case, thick, fastened with a brass clasp. Is that? She started. I don't know yet. I took what was in the locked drawer. He was already moving toward the horses. We need to be off the property. They rode hard for the first mile, then pulled back to a pace that wouldn't kill the horses, and she kept looking behind them the whole way. The flat gray sky, the empty road, the valley wide and cold and showing nothing. It wasn't until they were back at the cottonwood stand 2 miles from the Mercer gate that Rowan pulled up and opened the case. Inside, a series of letters, folded, in Kane's own handwriting and in handwriting she didn't recognize. A ledger page torn from a larger book. 2 receipts, each with a sum of money and a name below it. One name was Burl Sykes. She looked at the Sykes receipt for a long moment. The date on it was 11 days after the mine collapse. That's payment for his departure, she said. Yes. Rowan's voice was very quiet. And this... She lifted one of the letters, scanned it. The handwriting was dense and technical, referencing load-bearing specifications for the main shaft and a notation about timing that she had to read twice to understand. This is from the mine foreman, before the collapse. He's telling Kane the shaft is unsafe. He's asking for authorization to delay operations. Rowan read it over her shoulder. And Kane wrote back, Rowan said, reaching past her for the second letter in the sequence. Same handwriting as Kane's personal correspondence, same date stamp. He authorized continued operations. The cold was absolute around them. Neither of them said anything for a moment. He knew, she said. It was not surprise. It was the arrival of something she'd suspected for weeks, but knowing and having paper in your hands were different weights. He knew, Rowan said. She folded the letters carefully and put them back in the case and clicked the clasp shut. This goes to the federal commissioner, she said. Directly. Not through the mail. We hand deliver it. I'll ride to the county seat Monday morning, Rowan said. We go together. This shouldn't travel with one person alone. He looked at her. Caleb will agree, she said. He'll agree because he knows what this is. Rowan looked at the case in her hands for a moment. Then he looked at the road ahead and the mountains beyond it, and something moved across his face that was complicated and tired and not entirely resolved. Let's go home, he said. Caleb was at the kitchen table when they came in, and Luis was standing against the far wall with his arms crossed in a way that suggested something had happened while they were gone. What? Rowan said, reading the room. Ryder came an hour ago, Louise said. From town. He's asking for Mr. Mercer. Caleb held up an envelope. From Kane, he said. Delivered by a lawyer's clerk. Evelyn crossed the room and took the envelope from him and read it standing up. It was formal and cold and very clear. Kane's legal team was filing an emergency injunction with the county court to compel immediate boundary survey of the North Pasture, and was additionally filing a formal complaint with the county sheriff's office alleging that the Mercer operation had engaged in trespassing and theft against Kane's property. She looked up. He knows we were there, she said.
He knows someone was there, Rowan said. He doesn't know what we took. If he knew what we took, this letter would be different.
He'll figure it out when his locked drawer is empty, Caleb said. He doesn't know when to look. He doesn't know exactly what was in the drawer. Rowan set his hat on the table. We have a window, small one. If we can get the documents to the commissioner's office before Kane gets to a federal judge for an injunction, the evidence is on the record. He can't suppress it after that. Monday is too late, Evelyn said. We need to go tomorrow. Tomorrow is Saturday, Louise said. The commissioner's office in the county seat keeps weekend hours, she said. I confirmed it when I first wrote to them. They have a duty officer. She looked at Caleb. I need to take this tomorrow. First light. Caleb looked at the document case she was still holding. He looked at Rowan. He looked at her. Take the bay horse. Not Sutton, he said. She's faster on the long road. Thank you. Rowan goes with you. Of course. And he stopped. He looked at his hands. Come back, he said. It was simple and direct, and she understood everything in it. We will, she said. They left at 5 in the morning, the stars still sharp overhead, the road frozen and clean. They rode fast and mostly quiet, pushing the horses through the dark and then through the early gray and then into the full winter light that came up over the mountains and made everything sharp-edged and cold and real. It was an hour outside the county seat when Rowan said, without preamble, He's going to be there. She looked at him. Kane? Homies. He had men watching the ranch. If a rider went to him last night, he'll be in town. He'll try to intercept this before it gets filed. He looked at her. His lawyers can file a federal injunction if they know we have evidence. If they get to a federal judge before we get to the commissioner's officer, then we need to be at the commissioner's office when it opens, she said. It opens at 8. How far are we? An hour and 15 at this pace. She looked at the road ahead. Then we push. They pushed. The bay horse was everything Caleb had said she was, and Rowan's horse was fit and sure-footed, and they made the time. They hit the outskirts of the county seat as the church bells, which she registered without processing, were striking the 3/4 hour before 8. The commissioner's office was a stone building on the north end of the main street, and the duty officer, a tired-looking man named Hendricks, had already unlocked the door when they rode up. She was off the horse before it had fully stopped. She walked through the door with the document case under her arm and said, I need to file an evidentiary submission with the federal land investigation currently active under case number, she pulled the reference from memory, Valley Survey Case 17, Iron Ridge. Hendricks blinked at her. Ma'am, the investigator isn't in until Monday. The duty officer has authority to receive and officially timestamp evidentiary submissions, she said. That's in the Federal Land Commissioner's Procedural Regulations, Section 4. She set the case on his desk. I need you to open this, inventory the contents, timestamp each item, and give me a receipt. He looked at the case. He looked at her. He looked at Rowan, who was standing behind her saying nothing, which was the right instinct. Hendricks pulled the case toward him and opened the clasp. He went through the document slowly, and she watched his face, the slight changes in it as he read. The moment he got to the letter authorizing continued operations in the unsafe mine shaft, and his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. I'll need to log each item, he said. Please, she said. It took 22 minutes. He gave her a stamped receipt with a federal seal and his signature and the official timestamp, 8:09 a.m., Saturday, the 19th of December. She folded the receipt and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, in the same place she'd kept the Holst affidavit, and walked back out into the cold. Rowan was holding both horses. He looked at her face. Done? He said. Done, she said. He exhaled, a slow, controlled sound. Now?
Now we go home.
They were 2 blocks down the main street when she saw Kane's buggy parked outside the county judge's building. A man in a good coat was going up the steps at speed. She looked at it. Rowan looked at it. They kept riding. Whatever was happening in that building, it was too late. The receipt in her pocket said so in federal ink and federal timestamp, and that was a language even Silas Kane's lawyers couldn't argue with. Caleb was on the porch when they rode in. It was late afternoon, the light going, and he'd gotten himself out there in his chair despite the cold, and he was watching the road the way he'd been watching it, she suspected, since they left. She rode up to the gate, and he looked at her face. "It's filed," she said. He nodded once. Something in him settled. She could see it, a physical thing, like a man putting down something he'd been carrying uphill. "Come inside," he said. "Both of you. There's food." She put the bay horse up herself and took her time about it, brushing her down in the lantern light of the barn while the horse leaned into the brush with the uncomplicated gratitude of an animal who'd worked hard and knew it was over for the day. When she came into the house, Caleb was at the table and Rowan was at the stove, and the kitchen smelled like coffee and whatever Luis had left warming, and none of them said much for a while, which was fine. Some things didn't need to be talked into existence. Sometimes you just needed to sit in the same room with the people you'd come through something with and let the fact of still being there be enough. She sat down and put the stamped receipt on the table between them and left it there. Caleb looked at it. He reached out and touched the edge of it with one finger, not picking it up, just touching it. Then he pulled his hand back and picked up his coffee and said, "Denny said the east fence needs new posts before the next hard freeze." "I'll get to it Monday," Rowan said. "Good." And that was that. The lamp burned between them, and the cold pressed at the windows, and the ranch was quiet, in the way it was quiet when nothing was being taken from it, when it was simply itself, hard used, imperfect, real, and that was enough. The federal investigator arrived on a Tuesday, 3 weeks into January, riding in on a government horse with a second man behind him carrying a document case that was considerably larger than the one Evelyn had brought to the county seat in December. His name was Aldous Marsh, a compact, deliberate man in his 50s with reading spectacles he kept taking off and putting back on, and a way of moving through a room that suggested he'd been in a great many rooms and had stopped being impressed by any of them. He came to the Mercer Ranch first, which she took as a signal that the commissioner's office had read the documents she'd filed and understood what they were looking at. He sat at the kitchen table with his spectacles on and went through every piece of paper she had. The survey stake documentation, the photographs, the affidavit from Petra Holst's contact, the letters from Kane's locked drawer, the receipts, the ledger page. And he read with the particular stillness of someone for whom documents were the primary language of the world. Caleb sat at the end of the table. Rowan stood by the window. Evelyn sat across from Marsh and answered his questions as they came, which they did in a steady, methodical sequence that she appreciated. He didn't editorialize. He didn't express shock or sympathy. He asked what he needed to know and wrote down what she told him. After 2 hours, he took his spectacles off and set them on the table and looked at all 3 of them. "The mine documentation," he said. "The letter authorizing continued operations after the foreman's safety warning. Can you tell me how this came to be in your possession?" The room went quiet in a particular way. "It was recovered from Kane's property," Evelyn said. She said it plainly. "Through means that were not authorized." Marsh looked at her. "Trespassing." "Yes." He picked his spectacles up again, turned them in his hands. "Evidence obtained through unlawful means presents a complication for federal proceedings." "I understand that," she said. "However, the existence of the letters establishes a pattern of conduct that can be independently investigated. The federal mine safety records would show the same timeline. The foreman's written complaint, if it was logged, which it may have been, would be in those records. The receipts can be verified through banking records if a subpoena is issued for Kane's accounts." She looked at him steadily. "What we brought you is a map. The terrain it points to is verifiable through legitimate channels." Marsh looked at her for a long moment. "You worked in a law office," he said. It wasn't quite a question. 4 years. "It shows." He put his spectacles back on. "I'll need to interview each of you separately, and I'll need to speak with the Holst woman and with Horace Greer." He began writing something. "Mr. Mercer, the mine accident. Were you aware at the time of any safety concerns with the shaft? Not formally, Caleb said.
There was talk. The kind of talk men do around a mine when something doesn't feel right. I didn't take it as seriously as I should have. He said it without flinching. That's something I've had to sit with. Marsh nodded. He wrote it down.
The weeks that followed were not dramatic in the way that the weeks before had been. They were administrative, bureaucratic, slow. The machinery of federal oversight turning at its own pace, indifferent to urgency. Marsh came and went. Subpoenas were issued. Kane's lawyers filed responses and counter-responses. There were hearings in the county seat that Evelyn attended alone, sitting in the back of wood-paneled rooms and watching proceedings that moved like cold water, and taking notes, and coming home to report to Caleb and Rowan what had happened and what it might mean. Kane himself appeared at one of these hearings, the third one, in late January. He sat at the opposing table in his well-made clothes and his not quite a smile, and he looked at her across the room once, just once, and she held his gaze without difficulty because she'd been holding it since the sidewalk in October and she was no longer interested in the version of herself that would look away. His lawyer was good. She had to concede that. He was articulate and well-prepared, and he raised genuine legal complications about the admissibility of the mine documents and the chain of custody of the survey evidence. She sat in the back and listened and made notes and thought about how to address each point in the written response she'd prepare with Attorney Foss that evening. It was Foss, the attorney Horace Greer had recommended, a dry, sharp woman of about 50 who communicated primarily in declarative sentences, who told her, in early February, that the banking subpoena had come back. Kane's accounts show 2 payments to an individual named Burl Sykes, Foss said, spreading the documents on her desk. One dated 9 days post-collapse, one 30 days post. Together they total more than a working man would earn in 3 years. She looked at Evelyn over her spectacles. The mine safety complaint filed by the foreman was also located in the federal mining records. It was logged and received by the county mining authority. There's a notation beside it. Reviewed, no action required. Signed by the county mining inspector. But he might see it.
Who is now? Evelyn said. Retired, Foss said, and residing as of 8 months ago on a property in the Western Territories that he purchased for a sum considerably above what a county mining inspector's salary would typically support. Evelyn sat back in her chair. Kane built a system, she said. It wasn't surprise. It was the completed picture of something she'd been assembling piece by piece for months. He did, Foss said. The question is whether Marsh's office has the appetite to dismantle it. She paused. I think they do. The mine deaths make this something other than a property dispute. That changes the political calculus for the commissioner's office. Evelyn rode home with that and sat with Caleb after supper and told him what Foss had said, and he listened with his hands flat on the table and his eyes on the wall behind her. When she finished, he was quiet for a long time.
3 men died in that shaft, he said. Pete Doran, Marcus Webb, a man named Cowboy, who'd only been in the valley 6 months and whose family we never could track down. He stopped. Pete Doran had a wife and 2 boys. They left Iron Ridge after the accident. I don't know where they went. She didn't say anything. Sometimes the right thing was just to let a person say what needed saying. I've been carrying the idea that it was an accident, he said, that it was the frontier being what the frontier is, dangerous and indifferent, that nobody chose it. He pressed his hands harder against the table. Knowing someone chose it is different. It's a different weight. Yes, she said. Is there any possibility that Doran's family could be found? If there's legal action, if there are damages from the fraud? I've already asked Foss about it, she said. It's possible. If a judgment is entered, the family would have standing to file a claim. He nodded. He looked at his hands. Good, he said quietly. That matters. The confrontation, because that was what it was, even though it didn't look like what confrontations were supposed to look like, happened on a Thursday in the 3rd week of February. Federal Marshal Gaines arrived in Iron Ridge with 2 deputies and a sealed order from the commissioner's office, and the word spread through the valley the way words always spread in small places. Fast, through invisible channels, person to person. By the time Gaines's party reached Kane's compound, there were already people on the road watching. Greer was there. Petra Holst was there. Walt Alderman, whose barn had burned, was there with his wife beside him. Two of the other families who'd withdrawn their signatures from the letter in December were there, standing in the cold road with their hats in their hands and their faces set. Evelyn had not planned to go. She'd had the same conversation with herself that she usually had when something was happening that she could not control, that her job was at the ranch, managing the things that needed managing, and that she was not someone who needed to witness the resolution of a thing to believe it had resolved. She told herself this with some conviction while pulling her coat on, and had ridden out anyway, with Rowan beside her and neither of them saying much. They stopped on the hill above Kane's compound with the others. The federal party was at the gate below. Kane came out of the main house onto the porch. She could see him, small at this distance, his good coat, his careful bearing. He stood on the porch and looked at the marshal and at the order being presented to him, and she watched him the way she'd been watching him since October, reading what she could from the shape of it. He didn't yell. He didn't reach for anything. He stood on the porch and read the order and handed it back to his lawyer, who was standing beside him, and said something she couldn't hear from this distance. The lawyer said something back. Kane looked at the marshal, and then he looked at the crowd on the hill, and for a moment, even at this distance, she felt the quality of that look, the calculation of it. The man understanding, perhaps for the first time, that the isolation he'd counted on had been broken. He went back inside. The marshal's party did not go inside after him. They waited. They were, she understood, not there to arrest Kane. Not today. The order was civil, not criminal. The criminal process was moving on its own timeline, through the mine safety investigation, through the banking records, through the testimony of a retired mining inspector who had been located in the Western Territories and who, faced with the alternative, had apparently found some interest in cooperating. Kane would answer for those things eventually. What was happening today was the land fraud, the survey challenges, the fraudulent boundary filings, all of it suspended pending federal review. The Mercer North pasture boundary confirmed as legally protected under the original deed. It was not justice, exactly. It was the beginning of a process that would deliver something in the rough shape of justice, imperfectly, over time. She'd worked in a law office long enough to know the difference and to have made her peace with it. Rowan stood beside her on the hill, their horses close, and he said quietly, "It's not enough." "No," she agreed. "It's a start." He was looking at the compound below. 3 men died. And someone will answer for it, not today, but it's in motion. He was quiet for a moment. "You believe that?" She thought about it honestly. "I believe the record exists now. I believe Marsh is the kind of man who follows a record. And I believe that Foss knows how to use a record in a courtroom." She looked at him. "I don't believe in clean resolutions, but I believe in the process when the process has real teeth in it." He looked at her with that expression she'd stopped trying to categorize, the one that had too many things in it to reduce to a single word. "All right," he said. They rode home before the crowd dispersed, because there was still work to be done at the ranch, and because watching had never been the part that mattered to either of them. Caleb got sick in March, not from the accident, or not directly, though the accident had left him with a body that had less reserve than it used to. It was a fever that came on fast, the way fevers did in the winter to spring transition, and it settled in his chest, and for 10 days it was serious enough that the doctor from town came out twice and looked grave in the way doctors looked when they were being careful about what they said. She sat with him through the worst nights. Not because she'd decided to. There was no decision. She just didn't leave. She sat in the chair by his bed and read or wrote letters, or sometimes just sat with the lamp turned low while he slept. And she thought about the strange geometry of what their lives had become, and found that she didn't have a clean way to describe it, but that it felt, underneath everything, like something real. He was conscious and lucid through most of it, which was its own particular difficulty, being sick enough that your body was failing you but aware enough to know it. He was not, she discovered, good at being ill in the way some people were good at it, accepting and patient. He was irritable and restless, and twice tried to get himself to the window to look at the cattle situation, which she prevented both times with more firmness than tact. "The cattle are fine," she said, the second time. "Rowan checked the South Basin this morning. The creek is clear. Everything is where it should be." "You don't know that." "I do know that because Rowan told me, and Rowan doesn't tell me things that aren't true." He looked at her from the bed with his fever-bright eyes. "No," he said after a moment. He doesn't. The way he said it, the acknowledgement in it, sat between them for a moment with all its complicated weight. Caleb, she said.
I know, he said. I know, Evelyn. He closed his eyes. I'm not angry anymore. I want you to know that. I was for a while, but I'm not now. She didn't say anything.
What I feel now is mostly, he stopped, searching for the right word with the careful precision that was characteristic of him even when he was sick, even when it cost him. Grateful, he said. That's the truest word. That you came, that you stayed, that you did what you did for this ranch and for, he stopped again. For me. You don't have to. I want to, he said. Let me say it. He opened his eyes and looked at her. You made something here that I couldn't have made without you. I want that said plainly, so there's no version of the future where it's unclear. He looked at the ceiling. Now stop sitting there looking at me like I'm dying and go get me water because I'm genuinely thirsty. She got him water. She did not cry until she was in the hallway, and then only briefly because there was still a long night ahead, and she didn't have the surplus. He recovered. Slowly, with the particular stubbornness that she'd come to recognize as one of his defining characteristics. The refusal to stop being himself just because his body was making that difficult. By mid-March, he was at the kitchen table again, and by the end of March he was on the porch in the afternoons, watching the valley come out of winter with an expression she couldn't quite name, but recognized as something that lived close to peace. In April, on a Sunday afternoon, when the first real warmth had come back to the air, and the creek was running full and clean, and the valley had turned the pale green of early spring, Caleb asked Rowan to come sit with him on the porch. She wasn't there for that conversation. She was in the barn with Sutton, who had developed a minor issue with his left foreleg that she was monitoring. She heard their voices, low, indistinct, and she did not try to hear more than that. It was not her conversation. Rowan came to find her after, when the light was going gold and long across the yard. He came into the barn and stood in the entrance, and she looked at him and knew from his face that whatever had been said had been the real thing.
He told me to stop punishing myself for it, Rowan said. His voice was rough at the edges. He stopped, tried again. He said the only thing he couldn't forgive was if I spent the rest of my life being useful instead of happy, because he'd seen me do that for 8 years and it had been a waste of good capacity. She looked at him. Something in her chest shifted and resettled. That sounds like him, she said. Yeah, Rowan looked at the floor of the barn. He also said this ranch needs someone who's going to be here because they want to be, not because leaving feels like abandonment. He looked up. He said he wanted the deed updated, my name on it alongside his. She was quiet for a moment. He told me something similar in the fall, she said, about wanting the ranch to outlast any one person's circumstances. Rowan nodded. He was quiet for a long time, looking at nothing in particular, at the middle distance the way men looked when they were processing something they hadn't had words for until now. He's a better man than most, he said finally. Yes, she said. He is. There was nothing else that needed saying right then, and neither of them said it. She went back to Sutton's foreleg, and Rowan went to put his horse up for the night, and the barn was quiet around them, except for the sounds of animals settling and the creek running somewhere in the distance, and the particular evening sounds of a valley that had gotten through another winter. Caleb died in the first week of May, on a warm morning when the valley was fully itself again, green and wide and threaded through with the water that 2 creeks made where they came together on Mercer land. It was not sudden, and it was not peaceful in the way that word was usually meant. Nothing about it was clean or easy or without difficulty. But he was in his bed, and Evelyn was beside him, and in the end he went the way he'd lived most things, with more quiet than you'd expect and less complaint than seemed fair, and a kind of deliberate dignity that had always been the most characteristic thing about him. She sat with him for a long time after, not thinking much of anything, just being in the room with the reality of what had happened. The morning light came through the window and lay across the floor in long bars, and outside she could hear the ordinary sounds of the ranch, a horse in the paddock, Denny somewhere near the barn, the creek. All of it continuing, the world doing what the world did, which was continue. She went and told Rowan herself. He was at the fence line on the south pasture. When she rode up and he saw her face, he understood before she said anything.
He got down from his horse and stood in the spring grass, and she stayed on Sutton and told him plainly what had happened. And he stood there and took it with his arms at his sides and his face doing something she wasn't going to describe because it was his in private and not hers to name. Then he walked to her horse and put his hand on Sutton's neck and looked up at her. "Are you all right?" he said. "No," she said honestly. "Not right now." "All right," he said. He stood there with his hand on the horse's neck, steady, which was enough. They buried him on the Mercer land, on the low hill east of the house, where you could see both creeks and the mountains beyond them. And Horace Greer came, and Petra Holst came, and the aldermans came, and Louise and Denny, and a dozen other people from the valley who had known Caleb Mercer, or known of him, and who stood on that hill in the May warmth and said what needed saying. There was no ceremony beyond what people made themselves. And what people made was real and rough and occasionally funny, in the way eulogies sometimes were when people had actually known the person. Greer told the story of the North Fence dispute with an accuracy that made Evelyn laugh despite herself. And Denny said something short and honest that she was fairly sure he hadn't planned before he stood up to say it. And Rowan didn't speak at all, just stood at the back with his hat in his hands and his face still. She spoke last. She stood on the hill with the spring wind in her hair and looked at the people who had come, and she said, "I knew Caleb Mercer for less than a year. I came here under circumstances that were complicated, and so did he, and we figured it out between us the way people figure things out when they don't have the luxury of doing it slowly. What I know about him is that he built this ranch from nothing, and he lost everything he thought he was, and he rebuilt himself from that too. And he never once used his circumstances as a reason to be less than what he could be." She stopped. "He told me once that the frontier either breaks you or it shows you what you're actually made of. He'd been broken, and he wasn't done yet. I think that's worth saying. I think it's worth remembering." She sat back down. Rowan's hand found hers briefly. Just a touch, just a second. And then he let go, which was right. The legal proceedings resolved over the following months, in the way that legal proceedings resolved when the evidence was solid and the investigator was thorough. Not dramatically, not in a single moment, but in a series of rulings and filings and decisions that accumulated into a changed landscape. Kane's survey challenges were dismissed in full. The original Mercer deed was confirmed with prejudice, which meant it couldn't be challenged again on the same grounds. The mine fraud investigation resulted in criminal charges: negligent operation, falsification of safety records, bribery of a public official. Kane hired 3 lawyers and posted substantial bail and spent the summer in a legal fight that was, by any reading of the evidence, unwinnable. The retired county mining inspector cooperated fully in exchange for reduced charges and spent his remaining years in a situation that was unpleasant enough to be instructive. Burl Sykes was found in the Western Territories working under a different name. He gave a deposition. He cried during it, which she was told by Foss without editorial. She chose not to form an opinion about that. Pete Doran's family, his widow, a woman named Clara, and 2 boys, 12 and 9, were located through a network of postal correspondence that took 3 months to trace. Attorney Foss filed a civil damages claim on their behalf. The settlement was not everything. It was something real. Kane himself, the thing she thought about sometimes, in the way you thought about things you didn't entirely know how to feel about, pleaded to reduce charges 2 years later and spent time in a federal facility and was released eventually into a life that was, by all accounts, considerably diminished from what it had been. She didn't follow it closely. She found that she didn't need to. She'd needed the process. She'd needed the evidence on the record and the ruling in the federal books and the deed on the wall of the house. She didn't need to track what happened to him after that. What she needed was in front of her. It had been in front of her all along. The school was Rowan's idea, which surprised her. He brought it up one evening in the fall, their first fall without Caleb, the valley turning gold and red in the particular way it did when the season changed out here, the light going low and warm across the land. They were sitting on the porch after supper, not talking about anything in particular, and he said, "The alderman boys. The oldest one is 12 now. There's no school within riding distance." She looked at him. "There are other children too," he said. "The North Fork families. They're doing what people do, teaching at home, when they have time, which isn't always." He paused. "Caleb talked about it once. 2 years before I met you. He said the valley needed a school the way a body needed water. He never got to it. She thought about it. We'd need a building. There's the storage outbuilding on the east side of the yard. It needs work, but the bones are good. A teacher. I know someone. Petra Holst's niece. She came west last spring. She was a teacher in the city before, and she's not found her place out here yet. She looked at him, at the particular quality of attention he'd been paying to the people in this valley, the way he noticed things and stored them without making a performance of it. You've been thinking about this for a while, she said, since spring. He looked at his hands. I'm not someone who's good at the kind of things you're good at. The legal, the letters, the knowing the right argument. He paused. But I know this land. I know the people on it. I know what they need and what would hold them together. He looked at her. I thought if you handled the legal side of setting it up, I'd handle the building. She smiled, not at him, just into the evening air, at the shape of the thing they'd figured out how to be together. All right, she said, let's build a school. The school opened the following spring in a building that Rowan and Denny and 4 men from the North Fork farms had rebuilt from the frame out over the course of a winter. Petra Holst's niece, a young woman named Susanna with red hair and a directness that Evelyn immediately appreciated, arrived in March with a crate of books and a chalk set and a confidence that suggested she'd dealt with difficult rooms before. 11 children showed up on the first day. By the end of the month, there were 16. Evelyn stood in the yard on a morning in April and watched through the schoolhouse window as Susanna wrote something on the chalkboard that she couldn't read from outside, and the children in the rows of rough-cut desks that Rowan had made leaned forward to see it, and the morning light came through the windows at an angle that made the chalk dust in the air look like it was lit from inside. Rowan came to stand beside her. Walt Alderman put in 4 of those desks himself, he said. Brought them over on a Monday. Didn't say anything about it, just left them stacked by the door. His barn burned, she said. Yes. He looked at the window. People remember what it felt like to need help and not have it. Some of them, anyway. She thought about that for a moment. Caleb would have liked this, she said. He would have complained about the cost of the chalk, Rowan said, and she laughed. A real one, short and clear in the spring air. He looked at her when she laughed. She'd noticed he did that, watched her in the moment of it, like it was something he hadn't stopped finding worth seeing after all this time. Come on, he said. The north fence. Always the north fence, always. They walked back toward the barn and the horses and the long day's work, side by side. Their boots in the spring mud. Nothing resolved perfectly. Nothing finished. Everything ongoing in the way that life was ongoing. Not a conclusion, but a continuation, which was its own kind of gift. The deed was updated in June, both names on it, Rowan Cole and Evelyn Hart Mercer, in the careful script of the county clerk, witnessed and sealed and filed in the federal land records that now existed for Iron Ridge Valley without corruption in them. Caleb's name remained on the original deed, preserved in the record, which was how it should be. He had built the thing. His name belonged to it. She kept the receipt from the county clerk's office in the same folder where she kept the stamped federal receipt from December. The one dated 8:09 a.m., the morning they'd ridden hard to beat Kane to the commissioner's door. She kept both of them because they were, in their different ways, the same document. Evidence that something had been done. Proof that the work was real. Years passed the way years did. Not smoothly, not without difficulty, not in a straight line toward anything you could have predicted standing at the beginning of it. There were hard winters and dry summers, and seasons where the cattle prices dropped, and they had to make decisions she didn't like, and years where everything went wrong at once in the way that ranches and lives tended to do. There were new hands and old ones who left, and neighbors who sold out, and new families who came into the valley and had to be understood and eventually, usually, trusted. There were years when the legal work from Foss's office brought good news, and years when it brought complications they had to work through together. Rowan was not easy to live with. She'd known that before she chose it. He was private in ways that sometimes frustrated her, and had a stubbornness about certain things that was identical to the stubbornness that had kept him at this ranch for 8 years before she arrived, which meant she couldn't resent it too cleanly, because it was the same quality that had kept him steady when everything else was uncertain. He was also, underneath all of that, The most consistently honest person she had ever known, and she had come to value that more than she'd expected to. She was not easy either. She knew that. She worked too much and asked too many questions and had a tendency to prepare for trouble that was sometimes preparedness and sometimes just an old habit from a life that had needed it more than this one did. She was still, in certain moments, the woman who'd stood in a Baltimore hallway reading a letter that told her everything had changed and decided to get on the train anyway. The woman who moved toward things rather than away from them, even when moving toward them was harder. They were not a perfect thing, but they were a real one, and she had decided long ago that real was the better category. Their daughter was born in the 5th year, in the bedroom of the ranch house on a February morning while the snow came down outside, and she was small and loud and had her father's gray-green eyes and her mother's way of looking at things, that particular quality of attention that took stock of a room before committing to it. They named her Clara for Pete Doran's widow. 2 years later, a boy came and they named him Caleb because there was no other name that was right. She watched her children grow up on the frontier with the particular feeling of someone who understood what the frontier asked of people and chose to raise them in it anyway. Not because it was safe, because it was not, but because the things it asked were the same things she believed were worth asking. It asked you to work, and to be honest, and to show up for the people around you, and to not expect the land or the weather or the market or any particular circumstance to accommodate your preferences. It asked you to be the kind of person who was still standing after hard things. It was not a comfortable curriculum. It was a real one. On an evening in September, when Clara was 7 and young Caleb was 5 and the valley was full of the particular autumn gold that had not stopped being beautiful. No matter how many times she saw it, the children were on the porch doing what children did, and Clara asked her, out of nowhere, the way children asked things, without preamble or context, how everything had gotten started, how the ranch had come to be what it was, how the school had gotten built, how the valley had become what it had become. Evelyn sat in the chair that had been Caleb Mercer's chair, still on the porch, still facing the valley, still solid, and she thought about how to answer. She thought about a train smelling like coal smoke and a letter that had arrived in a Baltimore hallway. She thought about a man in a wheelchair on a porch watching a wagon come up the road. She thought about frozen ground and iron survey stakes and a document case and a stamped receipt and a fire that burned a barn and 3 men who died in a mine because someone had decided their lives were worth less than a property line. She thought about Rowan on a cold road in December, moving low and quick across open ground. She thought about a kitchen table in lamplight and the things that had been said around it and the things that had been held back. She thought about Caleb on the porch in the early morning, watching the mountains go from black to gold, saying some mornings it almost seems worth it. She thought about what she knew now that she hadn't known when she stepped off that train with her bad hat and her carpet bag and her private understanding that she had no other direction to go in. What she knew now was this. The people who built things were rarely the people who were best suited for it, or best equipped, or best positioned by circumstance. They were mostly people who had run out of easier options and found, in the running out, that what was left was enough. The greatness was never in the starting conditions. It was in the refusal to treat the starting conditions as the final word. She looked at her daughter, those careful gray-green eyes waiting for an answer, and she smiled. "Someone made a promise," she said, and then everything changed. And instead of leaving because things had changed, she decided to stay and see what could be built from what was left. She looked out at the valley, the school visible in the distance, the 2 creeks glinting where they came together, the mountains permanent and indifferent and somehow beautiful for being both. The greatest things out here were never built by people who had everything they needed. They were built by people who stayed when the road told them to go back. Clara considered this with the seriousness of a 7-year-old who was already the kind of person who considered things. "Was it hard?" she said. "Very," Evelyn said. "Was it worth it?" She looked at the valley for a long moment, at the land that had Caleb Mercer's name on it and Rowan Cole's name on it and her own name on it now, in federal ink, in the permanent record, at the school with the light still going in the window, at the creek that Kane had tried to take and hadn't, at the mountains that had been there before any of them and would be there after. "Yes," she said. She meant it entirely. It was worth it. Young Caleb climbed into her lap without asking, the way he did, and she put her arm around him, and the evening came down over the valley in its usual unhurried way, and somewhere in the barn Rowan was finishing the last of what needed finishing for the day, and the ranch was quiet and real around her, and that was enough. That had always been enough.